Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand stories of emperors and conquests, but to the dust of the Roman Colosseum. You're there with me now, in your togas, packed shoulder to shoulder on the cool stone seats. The sun is just starting its slow, theatrical descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the sand. There's a low hum in the air, 1,000 murmurs from a crowd that stretches as far as you can see. A sound like a distant, lazy beehive. The scent of wine and sweat and something more metallic hangs heavy. In the center, 2 figures stand. But this isn't a fair fight. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry. The history will be so boring you'll be asleep long before the main event. We're here to watch the unfair matches, the mismatches, the underdog stories where the underdog was almost always on a pre-written path to being a rug. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can all get sleepy together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the collective gasp, a wave of anticipation that ripples through the crowd. As the first pair of combatants enters the arena, the sand is cool beneath your sandals, still damp from being raked and smoothed. You see him. A hulking figure, a secutor, a pursuer. His helmet is a rounded, smooth dome, with only 2 small eye holes, designed to prevent a net from snagging on it. He's a walking tank, a fortress of bronze and leather. In his hand, a heavy, curved short sword, a gladius, a blade meant for close quarters butchering. He looks like something out of a futuristic movie, all sleek lines and brutal purpose. This isn't a movie, though. The air is thick with the scent of anticipation and the lingering aroma of the exotic spices the vendors were selling just minutes ago. You shift uncomfortably on your seat. Roman seating was not exactly designed for lumbar support. A fact you're learning firsthand. The man next to you, a portly merchant, elbows you in the ribs, pointing. "Look at that little mouse," he grunts. The mouse is the retiarius, the net man. He's a study in contrasts, nearly naked, wearing only a loincloth and a metal shoulder guard, a gallerus, on his left arm to protect his neck and shoulder. He doesn't carry a heavy shield or sword. Instead, he has a large net, a trident, and a small dagger tucked into his belt. He's the embodiment of agility and evasion, a dancer in a place of death. The crowd roars, a deafening sound that rattles your teeth. Historians still argue whether the crowd's roar was a natural sound or if it was amplified by the clever acoustics of the structure, which were designed to carry sound from the center. You feel a tickle in your nose from the dust being kicked up by the gladiators' feet, and you just want to sneeze. But you can't. Not now. The moment is too charged. This is the ultimate example of an unfair match. The secutor is a juggernaut, a wall of offense and defense, but he's slow. The retiarius is the epitome of speed and cunning, but he has no defense at all, just his ability to stay away and use his weapons with precision. The rules were clear. The secutor was to pursue, to chase his opponent down. The retiarius had to stay out of reach, use his net to entangle, and his trident to stab and keep the armored brute at bay. It's less a fight and more a grotesque game of cat and mouse, a lethal ballet. The retiarius feints, a blur of motion, his net held ready. The secutor lumbers forward, his head low inside his helmet, a breathing automaton. You can almost hear the soft scrapes of his sandals on the sand, a counterpoint to the thrumming in your ears. The tension is unbearable. You can almost taste the dust and the blood that hasn't even been spilled yet. You wonder if the gladiators felt it, too. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment street brawl. This was a choreographed dance of death. The kind of spectacle that held a society in its grip. The crowd loves the drama, the visual storytelling of it all. The unfairness is the point, the spectacle is the goal. There's a small, funny detail you notice. One of the vendors is still hawking his wares, yelling above the din. "Fresh wine, get your fresh wine," as if this were just another day at the market. And for them, it probably was. This wasn't a rare event. It was part of the fabric of Roman life. As common as going to the baths or the forum, it's a surreal mix of the mundane and the extreme. You find yourself leaning forward, caught up in the terrible energy of it all. You are here to see history, to feel it, and in a way, you are a part of it. One of the faceless thousands in the stands, the retiarius makes his move, a flick of the wrist, The net flies through the air, a dark cloud against the setting sun. The circuiter sidesteps, and the net lands on the sand with a soft thump. The crowd groans, a low, disappointed murmur. The show has just begun. The crowd's disappointment is just a momentary blip. The announcer's voice, booming through a primitive acoustic system of speaking tubes and megaphones, or maybe just a guy with really great lungs, cuts through the air. You hear the words Noxii and Bestiari, and the energy of the Colosseum shifts. The gladiatorial matches are the main course, but the morning was a different kind of show entirely. You settle back into your uncomfortable seat, noticing a small carving of a chariot on the stone beside you, a testament to someone's boredom during a long day of carnage. A vendor passes, now selling what looks like fried chickpeas, and you wonder if the Romans had a version of arena nachos. Before the main event, the Roman day at the Colosseum began with what are called the venationes, the animal hunts. A low, rumbling growl echoes from a grate somewhere beneath your feet. You look down at the sand and see faint drag marks, the signs of fresh blood being raked over. The smell of something wild and pungent, like a zoo on a hot summer day, replaces the metallic scent from before. Suddenly, a gate near the edge of the arena opens with a groan, and a magnificent, terrified lion is released. It blinks in the bright light, its mane a fiery corona, its paws splayed on the unfamiliar sand. This isn't a natural habitat, and the lion knows it. The animal isn't alone. It's immediately set upon by a group of men, the Bestiarii. These weren't gladiators in the traditional sense. They were specially trained hunters, armed with spears and bows, sometimes with only a small shield to protect themselves. Their role wasn't to engage in a fair fight, but to put on a spectacle of the hunt, to show the might of Rome over nature. The audience roars, not in anticipation of a duel, but in a kind of bloodlust for the exotic. You see another gate open, and a leopard, its coat like dappled sunlight, is released. The two animals, bewildered and afraid, circle each other. Then one of the Bestiarii strikes with a spear. This isn't a struggle for dominance, it's a slaughter. Historians still argue whether the lions and other animals were drugged to make them more manageable, or if their fear and confusion were considered part of the show. You watch a few of the Bestiarii work with a practiced, almost bored efficiency. It's a job, a very dangerous job, but a job nonetheless. One man, lean and quick, dodges a swipe from the lion, his spear finding its mark. The crowd cheers, a raw sound of triumph. You feel a small bit of pity for the animals, for these creatures ripped from their homes in North Africa or the Near East, only to die in a man-made desert. You also notice the man next to you is genuinely thrilled, a smile splitting his face. He points out a particularly daring move by one of the hunters, as if he's watching a football game. The purpose of the venationes was twofold. It was entertainment, of course, but it was also a powerful display of Rome's imperial reach. You're watching animals from the farthest corners of the known world being brought to a single, central point for the amusement of the people. This was a physical representation of how Rome had conquered the world. We have zoo animals now, but you can imagine a time when seeing a real giraffe for the first time would have been an almost mythical experience. We take it for granted now, but back then it was a profound symbol of Roman power. One can only imagine the logistics of getting these creatures across the Mediterranean, and you have to wonder if the people who managed it were paid in all-you-can-eat honey cakes. You hear another roar, this time from a different animal. A bull, an enormous black beast, is released. This one is clearly agitated, pawing at the sand. It's a different kind of fight, more brute force than cunning. The Bestiarii face it with a combination of spears and ropes. The sun beats down on the arena, and the dust is getting into your throat. You lean back and feel the rough texture of the stone against your back. You can almost feel the collective pulse of the crowd, the wave of a shared experience. The animals eventually succumb, and the men in charge of removing the bodies, the designatores, come out to clear the sand. The air smells of blood and trampled dust. But the crowd is already looking forward. They're ready for the main event. The last of the animal carcasses are dragged from the arena, leaving long, dark trails in the sand. You can see the designatores raking the surface, smoothing out the imperfections, a grim kind of housekeeping. The sun is getting higher, and you can feel its heat on your bare arms. The crowd shifts again, a low murmur building to a roar as the next part of the morning's grim entertainment begins. An announcer's voice, now a bit hoarse, bellows the name of the next act. This is the part of the day most people don't want to talk about, even the Romans. These are the public executions, or noxi. You're seeing the grim, practical side of Roman justice. The convicted are brought into the arena, not as fighters, but as condemned criminals. Their hands are bound, their faces pale with terror. You can feel the change in the crowd's mood. The playful excitement of the animal hunt is gone, replaced by a cold, quiet sense of judgment. This isn't a spectacle of skill, it's a statement of power. The executions were used by the Roman authorities as a tool of social control, a public display of the consequences of breaking the law. It's a very harsh reality check for a society that was both sophisticated and brutal. The executions take many forms. Some are thrown to the remaining wild animals, a horrifying reenactment of the morning's hunt. You see a man being led to a cage where a large, agitated bear is pacing. The bear growls, a deep, guttural sound that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The man is pushed into the cage, and the gate is locked behind him. The crowd goes silent, an eerie hush falling over the vast structure. Historians still argue about whether these specific events were a deterrent or just a source of cruel entertainment. You're trying not to look, but you can't turn away. This is a moment where the full, chilling reality of the Roman world hits you. Other criminals are subjected to different forms of death. You watch as some are put to the sword by professional executioners, men who do their job with a grim efficiency, their movements quick and practiced. It's over almost before it begins. A flash of steel, and the deed is done. One of the more theatrical forms of execution, and one you've heard about, is the reenactment of mythological tales. For example, a criminal might be cast in the role of Icarus and thrown from a high point in the arena, or as Prometheus, tied to a stake while an eagle, trained for the purpose, pecks at him. It's a strange and unsettling blend of art and sadism, of ancient myths and real, agonizing death. You remember something you read? A quirky detail, in some cases. The convicted criminals were forced to fight each other to the death. A form of gladiator fight where both opponents were completely untrained and unarmored. It's the kind of detail that makes you shake your head. A fringe tidbit that highlights the cruelty of the era. The man next to you sips his wine, completely unfazed. This is normal for him. This is what you do on a day out. The executions are over as quickly as they began. The bodies are unceremoniously dragged out through one of the gates, and the ground is again raked and smoothed. The smell of fear and death lingers in the air, a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere that will soon return. You see a team of men with buckets of water and sand, scrubbing and refreshing the surface. It's a quick, efficient process, preparing the stage for the next act. The crowd stirs. A low hum of chatter returning as they wait for the afternoon's main event. It's a shocking transition from a place of brutal death to a place of athletic spectacle. You find yourself wondering how a society can move so quickly from one emotional state to another. How could they watch this and then cheer for gladiators, seeing them not as victims, but as heroes? You're starting to understand that the Roman worldview was a complicated mix of pragmatism, piety, and a profound comfort with violence. You close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them, the sun is high and the sand is clean. The stage is set for the afternoon, the raking of the sand is finished, and a new scent is wafting through the air, not of blood, but of fresh soil, as if they've added a new layer. You watch as a different group of men enters the arena, not to fight, but to perform a sort of ritualistic parade. These are the gladiators, the main attraction. Their armor gleams, polished to a mirror finish, and their helmets are adorned with colourful plumes. They look less like soldiers and more like athletes, or even celebrities, and the crowd's energy spikes. But you're thinking about where they came from. You're thinking about the life of a gladiator before he ever stepped into this grand, deadly theatre. You step away from the Colosseum in your mind's eye, a little bit of historical teleportation, and find yourself outside a ludus, a gladiator school. The walls are high, the gates are thick, and the air inside is a mixture of sweat, leather, and hard-won discipline. Life in a ludus was not what you might expect. It wasn't a constant, bloody free-for-all. It was more like a highly structured, incredibly harsh boot camp. The lanista, the owner and manager of the school, was a harsh master, and every aspect of a gladiator's life was controlled. You see a line of men, some muscular and imposing, others surprisingly wiry and quick, running drills in a dusty yard. They practice with wooden swords and shields, their movements precise and repetitive. The training was incredibly intense. Gladiators were taught to fight, of course, but also to entertain. They learned specific moves and techniques tailored to their chosen class. A retiarius, like the one you just saw, would spend hours practicing with his net and trident, learning how to entangle an opponent and then strike. A secutor would train to move with the heavy weight of his armor, building the endurance and strength needed to outlast his more nimble opponent. The training was less about winning every fight and more about putting on a good show. The goal was to make the fight last, to build tension and drama. A quick kill was often a disappointment to the crowd. You notice something quirky about the training. Gladiators were not just taught to kill, they were also taught how to take a hit. They practiced with blunt weapons to learn how to fall, how to receive a blow in a way that looked dramatic but was less likely to be fatal. A fallen gladiator wasn't necessarily a dead one. The goal was to control the narrative of the fight, from the opening flourish to the final tense moment. Historians still argue whether the ludus was more of a prison or a professional sports academy. The truth is, it was a little of both. It was a place of extreme discipline, but also a place where a man could, however small the chance, find a way out of servitude or a path to fame. Life in the ludus wasn't just about training, it was also about survival. Gladiators were chained at night, and they were forbidden from leaving the grounds without permission. But they also had access to surprisingly good medical care and a specific, highly nutritious diet. Remember that largely vegetarian diet? They ate a lot of beans and barley, often supplemented with a paste made from burnt bone or ash, which was believed to help heal broken bones. It's a far cry from the stereotypical meat and potatoes diet you might expect. You can almost hear the soft thud of wooden swords hitting shields, the grunt of effort, the sharp commands of the lanista. You imagine the conversations, the whispered rivalries, the quiet moments of despair and the fleeting moments of hope. For most of these men, life had been harsh before they arrived. They were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. But here, they had a chance to become something more. They were being forged into weapons, yes, but also into performers. They were learning a new trade, a very dangerous trade, but one that could bring them recognition, and for a lucky few, freedom. The life was brutally hard, but it was a path, a bloody, uncertain path, but a path nonetheless. From the brutal reality of the training grounds, you are now back in the Colosseum, watching the gladiators parade before the crowd. They are the same men you just saw sweating in the dust of the ludus, but here they are transformed. Their armor gleams, their hair is styled with oil, and their bodies are toned and powerful. They walk with a mix of swagger and solemnity, and you can see the way the crowd looks at them. It's a look of fascination, a complex blend of admiration, fear, and a morbid curiosity. This is the paradoxical social status of the gladiator. They were both reviled and idolized, the rock stars of the Roman Empire, and at the same time, the lowest of the low. On one hand, gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals. They occupied the absolute bottom rung of Roman society, lower than the most common laborers. The word infamia was used to describe them, a legal and social designation that stripped them of all rights and respect. They could not vote, they could not own property, and their lives were considered expendable for a Roman citizen. Even being seen with a gladiator in public could be a stain on one's reputation. It's a strange contradiction. You might be a hero in the arena, but once you stepped out, you were still a slave. A funny thought occurs to you. It's like being a famous movie star who, after the film ends, has to go back to being a waiter. On the other hand, their fame was immense. The most successful gladiators, the champions, were household names. Their faces were painted on walls, their names were whispered by Roman youths, and their images were stamped on oil lamps and mosaics. Women, especially, were fascinated by them. Graffiti found in Pompeii and other Roman cities praises gladiators as the heartthrobs of girls, or the glory of girls. A famous gladiator could earn an enormous amount of money, a fortune that could, in theory, buy his freedom. One gladiator, a Syrian named Flamma, was offered his freedom 4 times, but turned it down, choosing to remain in the arena for the glory and the riches. Historians still argue whether this was a true display of devotion to his craft or a sign that he was addicted to the celebrity and the spectacle of it all. The life of a gladiator was short and violent, but for some, it was a better life than what they had known. Many of these men were captured soldiers or slaves from conquered territories. They had a roof over their heads, regular food, and access to the best medical care available at the time, which was often better than the average Roman citizen received. They were given a purpose, a chance to fight for something more than just survival. They were trained, fed, and housed by their owners, who saw them as valuable, if temporary, assets. You can almost feel the dichotomy of their existence. When they enter the arena, they are gods, their fate in their own hands, or in the hands of the emperor. The crowd's adoration is a palpable thing. But when a gladiator falls, when he is defeated and his life hangs on the whim of a thumb gesture from the emperor, he is nothing more than a slave, a piece of property about to be disposed of. This is the essence of the Colosseum's drama, the constant tension between life and death, between celebrity and servitude. You remember the old saying, morituri te salutant, those who are about to die salute you, a phrase gladiators were said to have uttered to the emperor. But recent scholarship suggests this was likely only said at one specific naval show. That's a quirky tidbit to file away. The truth is, their lives were more complex, more nuanced than a simple, dramatic death chant would suggest. They were men in an impossible situation, trying to live, or die, with dignity. The gladiators are now a blur of motion, a dance of steel and sweat. But you're thinking about the money. This entire spectacle, this massive display of power and brutality, was fueled by one thing, economics. It wasn't a free-for-all, it was a business. From the lowliest vendor selling fried chickpeas to the emperor himself. Everyone had a stake in the games. You can almost see the gears turning behind the scenes. The constant flow of money that made this entire, gory machine work. First, there was the sponsorship. Gladiatorial games were expensive, incredibly so. The cost of acquiring, feeding, training, and equipping a gladiator was enormous. The people who put on the games, the editor or sponsor, were usually wealthy individuals seeking to gain political popularity. By bankrolling a show, they could impress the public, curry favour with the emperor, and solidify their own power. A successful show could be a career-making move. You can imagine a Roman politician spending a small fortune to host the games, just like a modern politician might spend a fortune on a campaign ad, though this campaign ad involves lions and swords. Then there was the ticket sales, or rather, the lack of them. Surprisingly, the games were often free for the public. The Colosseum had a tiered seating system, and tickets, or tesserae, were distributed to citizens based on their social status. However, the seats were highly coveted. You can see the sheer number of people, a crowd of 50,000, all clamouring for a spot. The tesserae were small clay or bone tokens that designated a specific entrance and seat number, a bit like a modern-day concert ticket. A quirky detail you recall is that the seating was incredibly democratic in its access, but wildly hierarchical in its arrangement. The front seats were for the emperor and senators, the back rows for the common folk. You, with your humble toga and sandal choice, are probably a bit high up, a bit far from the action, but still able to feel the roar of the crowd and smell the sweat, of course. The people who really made money were the lanistae, the owners of the gladiator schools. They were essentially businessmen who owned human assets. They would lease out their gladiators to the sponsors for a fee. The better a gladiator was, the more he was worth. A champion gladiator could command an astronomical price for a single fight. It was a risky business. Of course, one bad day in the arena could mean the loss of a valuable investment. It was the ancient world's version of the stock market. Except the stocks had a better chance of being eaten by a bear. The business didn't stop with the gladiators. You see vendors weaving through the crowd, selling wine, bread, and other food. They're making a tidy profit off the long, slow day of entertainment. The surrounding area was also a bustling marketplace, a kind of ancient food court where people could get a meal before or after the games. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of spectacle, it was an economic engine, a hub of commerce that supported a huge number of people. From the men who cleaned the cages to the ones who polished the bronze armor. Historians still argue whether the games were a net positive for the Roman economy or just a massive drain on the state's resources. You can see a bit of both. It created jobs, but the cost was immense. You feel a ripple of excitement as the main event begins. But you're no longer just seeing a fight, you're seeing a business transaction, a political statement, and a form of mass media, all rolled into one. The dust and the blood are just the visible parts of a much more complex and fascinating machine, a machine that ran on a constant flow of gold coins and the roar of the crowd. The fight is on now, a brutal dance of evasion and brute force. But your eyes aren't on the combatants. You're looking at the man in the imperial box. He is the most powerful man in the world, and in this moment, his power is absolute. The emperor sits in his private, shaded viewing box, a place of unparalleled luxury and vantage. He is the one who decides life and death. You watch him closely. His expression is impassive, a mask of calculated indifference. This isn't just entertainment for him, it's a tool of his rule. The emperor's role in the arena was a masterclass in political theatre. His power was made manifest in a single gesture, the turn of a thumb. We've all heard of the thumbs up or thumbs down, but historians still argue whether the gesture was really thumbs down for death. The most widely accepted theory is that a turned down thumb was actually a signal for sword in sheath, a symbol for life and mercy. The signal for death was a thumb pointed toward the throat or a fist with a thumb inside. A subtle but deadly distinction. Whatever the specific gesture, the power was the same. The crowd would roar their approval or disapproval, but the final decision rested with the emperor, a gladiator, panting and exhausted, would look up at the stands, not at the mob, but at the one man who held his fate in his hand. The emperor used this power to project an image of himself. If he spared a gladiator who had fought bravely, he was seen as a merciful and generous ruler. If he gave the death signal, he was seen as a just and resolute leader, unwilling to tolerate weakness. It was a no-win scenario for the gladiator, but a public relations goldmine for the emperor. It was his chance to show the people that he was in charge, that he was the ultimate arbiter of justice and fate. A quirky detail you recall is that sometimes an emperor would even stand in as a gladiator himself, or so it was rumoured, though likely in highly staged, non-lethal bouts with blunted weapons. This was less about fighting and more about showing a kind of solidarity with the common man, a powerful bit of propaganda. The emperor's role wasn't just about giving the thumbs up or down. He was also the one who sponsored the most extravagant games, the ludi. He would spare no expense in bringing in exotic animals and the most famous gladiators, and in doing so, he would remind the people of Rome's wealth and power. This was a visible display of his generosity. It was a political calculation. By providing the people with what they wanted most, bread and circuses, he could keep them happy and distracted from the more pressing issues of politics and governance. The Colosseum was a safety valve, a place where the people could let off steam and feel like they were part of something grand, something powerful. You watch as the emperor leans forward, his hand resting on the marble railing. The fight has reached its climax. The secutor has finally cornered the retiarius, his sword raised for the final blow. The crowd is a cacophony of shouts and screams, all calling for different fates. Mercy, others yell. It's a roar of thousands of voices, a powerful and chaotic sound, but you know that ultimately, none of it matters. The secutor stands over his defeated opponent, his chest heaving, his gaze fixed on the man in the imperial box. All he can do is wait. The emperor's face is a study in calm. He considers, for a long moment, the man's courage, the crowd's whim, and his own political standing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hand moves. The emperor's hand moves, a flash of motion, and the crowd explodes. You feel the sound in your chest, a physical vibration of thousands of people screaming, shouting, and cheering. The noise is a chaotic, primal force, a blend of elation and disappointment, but most of all, a release of tension. This is the heart of the Colosseum's power, the crowd's insatiable hunger. They are not just spectators, they are participants. They've invested their emotions, their voices, and their afternoon in this moment, and their reaction is a powerful testament to their complex relationship with violence. It's easy to dismiss the Roman crowd as a bloodthirsty mob, but their psychology was more nuanced. They weren't just there for the gore, they were there for the drama, the narrative. and the spectacle. They cheered for a good, hard-fought battle, not necessarily a swift death. They had their favourites, their champions, and their rivalries. A gladiator from one school might have a devoted fan base that rivaled a modern-day sports teams. You can almost feel the collective energy, the shared experience of 50,000 people reacting as one. It's a kind of tribalism, a feeling of belonging to something much larger than yourself. The crowd's energy also had a political dimension. The emperor and other sponsors had to listen to the crowd. If the people were unhappy, they would make it known, booing a decision they didn't like or demanding mercy for a brave fighter. This was one of the few places where the average Roman citizen could publicly voice their opinion, and they used it to their full advantage. The crowd's reaction was a subtle form of political pressure, a way for the masses to influence their leaders. Historians still argue how much this mob rule truly influenced imperial decisions, but it was a factor that every emperor had to consider. You notice something quirky about the crowd's behavior. The more famous and beloved a gladiator was, the more likely the crowd was to demand he be spared, even in defeat. A champion, a man who had fought and won many times, was an investment in the spectacle. Killing him would be like a movie studio killing off its biggest star. It would be a bad business decision and a disappointment to the fans. The gladiators knew this, and they would fight not just to win, but to impress, to put on a show that would earn them the crowd's affection and support. They fought for their lives, but also for their legacy. You can see the retiarius, defeated on the sand, not looking at the emperor, but at the crowd. He is silently pleading with them, with his body, with his brave fight. The crowd's roar subsides as the fate of the retiarius is sealed. The emperor, in this instance, has given the sign for mercy, a decision that a wise emperor would often make to appear magnanimous and to save a valuable asset for future shows. The retiarius is helped to his feet, and the crowd gives a final, thunderous cheer of approval. The fight is over, and the people are happy. The gladiator will live to fight another day. The Colosseum, in this moment, is not just a place of death, but also a place of hope, of mercy, and of the profound, if sometimes terrifying, power of the people. It's an interesting juxtaposition, the casual brutality of the morning executions giving way to the complex, almost artistic, drama of the gladiatorial matches. The sun is now a fiery orb, casting long shadows across the arena, a perfect backdrop for the show. As the crowd begins to disperse for a brief intermission, your mind pulls back from the visceral chaos of the spectacle and turns to the spectacle itself, the Colosseum. You've been sitting here for what feels like hours, a small part of a vast, breathing organism, and you begin to notice the details of its construction. This isn't just a big stadium, it's a masterpiece of Roman engineering, a marvel that has stood for nearly 2 millennia. The fact that it's still largely intact, a testament to its builders, is a quiet kind of boring history that deserves your attention. You look around and marvel at the tiered seating, the massive archways, and the sheer scale of the building. The Romans didn't have modern tools, but they had an incredible understanding of geometry, mechanics, and material science. The Colosseum was built with a combination of concrete, stone, and brick, each material serving a specific purpose. The foundation was a massive concrete slab, over 12 meters thick in some places, which supported the immense weight of the structure. The outer walls were built with travertine stone, quarried from just outside Rome. A quirky tidbit you recall is that the holes in the stone you can still see today were caused by the removal of the iron clamps that held the blocks together, a testament to a later, less respectful era when the Colosseum was stripped for its materials. The structure's genius lies in its use of arches. The Colosseum is essentially a series of concentric rings of arches, which allowed for an even distribution of weight. This system, known as the arcade, was a Roman innovation that gave their buildings incredible strength and stability. It also created a magnificent visual rhythm, a repetitive pattern of light and shadow. You can see the arches of the 3 outer floors, one above the other, each with a different architectural order: Tuscan on the ground floor, Ionic on the second, and Corinthian on the third. This wasn't just for show, it was a way of using different column types to bear different loads, a practical application of architectural principles. The Colosseum was designed for efficiency, not just aesthetics. The 80 entrances and exits, called vomitoria, from the Latin word for a rapid discharge, allowed the massive crowd to enter and exit the building in a matter of minutes. You can imagine the feeling of being part of that human river, flowing out of the arena at the end of the day. The flow was so efficient that some historians have even used the Colosseum's design as a model for modern crowd control and public transportation systems. You can almost hear the sounds of construction, the chisels of the stonemasons, the shouts of the workers, the rumble of carts carrying materials. The construction was a massive undertaking, employing tens of thousands of people and taking only about 10 years to complete. The speed with which it was built is a tribute to Roman organization and engineering. A fringe detail is that the amphitheater was largely funded by the spoils of the Roman sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, a grim but powerful reminder of the empire's military might. As you sit in your seat, you feel a small draft of cool air wafting up from the floor. You're starting to realize that the Colosseum is more than just a place of death and spectacle. It's a testament to human ingenuity, a structure that was built to last, to impress, and to serve a very specific and very Roman purpose. The architects were not just building a stadium, they were building a monument to the power of Rome and its ability to bend the world to its will. The gladiators are back on the sand, a new pair ready to fight, but you're still thinking about the structure of the Colosseum. Your mind drifts from the sunlit stands to the dark, mysterious world beneath the arena floor. You imagine a staircase leading down, a stone spiral, and you begin to descend. The sound of the crowd fading to a muffled roar above you. You are now in the Hypogeum, the vast underground labyrinth that was the true heart of the Colosseum's spectacle. The air is cool and damp, and it smells of earth, animals, and something metallic, a scent that is both ancient and chilling. You can barely make out the stone corridors in the dim light. This place was a world unto itself, a hidden city of ropes, pulleys, and cages. It was here, in this dark, subterranean world, that the magic of the Colosseum's spectacle was truly made. This was where the animal hunts were prepared, where the gladiators waited for their moment, and where the most incredible special effects were produced. You pass what looked like small, sturdy cages. You can almost hear the soft growls and the heavy breathing of the big cats, the tense silence of a captured bear. These were the animal pens, where the lions, tigers, and bears were kept before being lifted to the arena floor. This was a logistical nightmare, a fact that historians still debate how the Romans managed with such apparent ease. A quirky tidbit you recall is that the animals were likely kept in darkness to keep them calm and disoriented before being released into the bright light of the arena. A cruel but effective trick of animal management. Further on, you come across the remnants of a series of ramps and a complex system of pulleys and counterweights. This was the elevator system, an ingenious bit of engineering that allowed animals, props, and even entire sets to be raised from the Hypogeum to the arena floor. You can almost hear the creak of the ropes and the groans of the winches as a rhinoceros or an elephant was lifted into the light. This was a spectacle in and of itself, a moment of pure magic that would have been awe-inspiring for the audience above. It's like a massive theatrical stage, but instead of actors, the performers are wild animals and condemned men. You also see the small, cramped rooms where the gladiators would wait for their turn. You can imagine the tension in the air, the silent prayers, the nervous energy. This was a holding pen for human beings, a final staging area before a life-or-death confrontation. The contrast between this dark, claustrophobic space and the bright, open arena above is a powerful one. One can only imagine the thoughts that went through a man's mind as he was led up the ramp, away from the darkness and toward the sunlight and the roar of the crowd. The Hypogeum was also the site of one of the more gruesome parts of the Colosseum's operation, the processing of the dead. It was here that the bodies of the gladiators and animals were brought after a fight to be disposed of. You can imagine the scene, the blood, and the silence after the roar of the crowd. The Hypogeum was a place of quiet, efficient, and horrifying practicality. It was a place where all the glamour and spectacle of the arena was stripped away, and all that was left was the brutal, unromantic reality of death. The Colosseum, in a way, was a dual structure, one of light and glory, and one of darkness and death. and they were both in a kind of perfect, gruesome, Roman balance. You're out of the Hypogeum, and you're back in the stands. A hush has fallen over the crowd. A different kind of quiet. This is the calm before the storm, before the next spectacle. But this one is different. You hear whispers of naumachia, a Greek word that means naval battle. You can see men in the arena, dressed as sailors and soldiers, but they are not fighting yet. They are standing on what looks like a shallow pool of water. Wait, a shallow pool of water. You look closer, and you see that the arena floor is slowly, almost imperceptibly, being filled with water. This is one of the great mysteries of the Colosseum and a major topic of historical debate. Was the arena floor actually flooded for mock naval battles? And if so, how? It seems unbelievable, given the sheer scale and the logistics involved, but Roman historians, including Cassius Dio, claim that Emperor Titus did, in fact, stage a naval battle to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum. The account claims that the floor was flooded to a depth that was sufficient for ships to float and engage in a full-scale battle. You can imagine the spectacle. Tiny warships, miniature versions of the real thing, sailing and ramming each other in the centre of Rome. It's an almost unbelievable image. Historians still argue whether this was even possible. The Hypogeum beneath the arena floor, which you just explored in your mind, was a complex, multi-level structure of tunnels and passages. Some scholars argue that there simply wouldn't have been enough time to flood and then drain the arena, especially with the daily schedule of events. Others point out that the Hypogeum as we know it today was a later addition, built by Emperor Domitian, Titus's brother, who may have been responsible for the complex system of elevators and cages, which would have made flooding the arena a practical impossibility. A quirky tidbit you recall is that the Romans were masters of hydraulics and aqueducts, so it's not completely outside the realm of possibility. The technology to move water on a massive scale was something they had perfected, assuming it was possible. You can only imagine the show, the sun glinting off the water, the splash of oars, the shouts of the men, all against the backdrop of the massive stone structure. The ships were likely smaller than real warships, and the battles were probably highly choreographed. But the effect would have been stunning. The naval battles were also a form of Roman propaganda. They were a way of celebrating Rome's naval supremacy, its control of the seas. It was a display of power, a watery counterpart to the land battles that were the more common fare. You can almost feel the chill of the mist coming off the water. The man next to you, the one who was so excited about the animal hunts, is leaning forward, his mouth agape. This is something new, something that even the most jaded Roman spectator would find impressive. The water level rises slowly, reaching about a meter in depth. The ships, replicas of Greek and Roman triremes, are lowered into the arena, and the men take their positions. This is the quiet before the storm. The stage is set for a mock sea battle. You find yourself wondering if, in the end, it was worth it. The sheer effort and time it would have taken to create such a brief but unforgettable spectacle. The answer, you realize, is probably yes. For the Romans, nothing was too extravagant when it came to projecting the image of their empire's might. The show is about to begin, the mock sea battle has ended, and the water is draining away through a series of grates. A low gurgle, a reminder of the engineering genius at work. The afternoon sun is high and you're starting to get a little sleepy. You've been here all day, and you begin to think about the logistics of it all. The Colosseum wasn't a one-off event, it was a daily operation, a machine of spectacle that required a small army of people to run. You start to see the day, not from the perspective of a spectator, but from the perspective of the people who made it happen. You imagine the day starting long before dawn. The animal handlers, or bestiarii, would be up, preparing the cages and making sure the exotic animals were in place. The Lannistae would be waking their gladiators, making sure they were fed and ready for the day's combats. The team of engineers would be checking the pulleys and winches in the Hypogeum, making sure everything was in working order for the grand reveals. There was a constant hum of activity behind the scenes, a world of boring but essential labour. You remember the vendors you saw, the ones selling fried chickpeas and wine. They would have to be up early as well, setting up their stalls and preparing their wares for the massive crowds. The Colosseum had a surprising number of full-time staff. There were the ushers, or designatories, who were responsible for guiding people to their seats and maintaining order. You can imagine them, dressed in their uniforms, navigating the crowded walkways with a practiced ease. There were the men who raked the sand and cleaned up the bodies, the libitinarii and their helpers, a grim but necessary part of the operation. There were the doctors, or medici, who were on standby to treat the injured gladiators, often with a mix of surprisingly advanced knowledge and a healthy dose of superstition. A quirky detail you recall is that gladiatorial doctors were so specialized and well-respected that they were often better trained than the doctors who treated average citizens. A key part of the day's routine was the maintenance of the arena itself. The sand, or arena, had to be refreshed, and the blood and other bodily fluids had to be covered or removed. You can almost smell the scent of fresh sand and water being used to sanitize the space. It was a cycle of death and renewal, a constant effort to keep the stage clean for the next act. This was all happening while the crowd was settling in, a silent, almost invisible dance of laborers keeping the show on the road. Historians still argue about the exact number of people it took to run the Colosseum on a daily basis. Was it a few hundred, or a few thousand? The truth is likely somewhere in between. But the point remains the same. This was a massive logistical undertaking. It was a testament to Roman organization and their ability to mobilize resources, both human and financial, for a single purpose. The Colosseum was not just a symbol of power, it was a demonstration of a perfectly run, perfectly choreographed piece of daily life. As the final drops of water drain from the arena, you feel a renewed sense of respect for the unseen heroes of the Colosseum, the people who made sure the show went on, day after day, year after year. The arena is ready for the next combatants, but you take a moment to look at the people around you. You are part of the vast crowd, one of the 50,000 Romans who have come to the Colosseum for a day of spectacle. You begin to see the day, not as a grim historical event, but as a social ritual. A day in the life of a Roman. This is a day out. A Roman spectator's experience was a blend of anticipation, social networking, and a little bit of snacking. You can feel the festive atmosphere. Vendors are still hawking their wares, wine, bread, and what you've now identified as pulse, a kind of porridge. People are chatting, laughing, and trading gossip. For many Romans, especially the common people, this was a rare opportunity for a day off. A chance to get out of the city's crowded, noisy streets and into a place of public gathering. It was a social event, a chance to see and be seen. You can hear a group of teenagers teasing each other, their voices high and excited. You can see a family, a father pointing out the different types of gladiators to his son. This wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of life. The day had a specific rhythm. The morning was for the animal hunts and the executions, the parts of the show that were designed to be shocking and terrifying, but the afternoon was for the gladiatorial matches, the main event. This was the part of the show that was more like a sporting event, with its own stars, rivalries, and fan clubs. The crowd would often chant the names of their favorite gladiators, and you can hear a group of people near you, all wearing the same color of tunic. A fan club for a champion gladiator you haven't seen yet. Historians still argue whether the fan clubs were organized and what their social dynamics were like, but you can feel the sense of belonging, the shared excitement. A quirky tidbit you recall is that the Romans had a betting culture around the games. While direct betting in the arena may have been illegal at times, you can be sure that people were making wagers on the side, a fact that added to the excitement. You can almost hear a low murmur of people passing coins back and forth. The unpredictability of the matches, even the ones that were designed to be unfair, made the betting all the more thrilling. A surprise victory by our underdog was the stuff of legend, a story that would be told for years to come. As you sit there, you realize that the Colosseum was more than a place of entertainment. It was a mirror of Roman society, the strict seating arrangement, from the emperor at the top to the lowest citizens at the back, was a physical representation of the social hierarchy. The gladiatorial matches, with their mix of brutality and celebrity, reflected the Roman worldview, which was a strange mix of pragmatism and spectacle. This was a society that was both deeply religious and deeply cynical, and the Colosseum was the perfect stage for it. You lean back, close your eyes, and listen to the sounds of the crowd. It's a sound that is both ancient and universal. The sound of people coming together to watch a show, to escape their daily lives, and to feel a part of something bigger. The gladiators are back, and their entrance is a dramatic one. A slow procession with the sun glinting off their armor. You can't help but notice how incredibly fit they are. Their muscles clearly defined under the straps of their armor. But what were they eating? The image of gladiators feasting on roasted meats and rich foods is a common one. But it's completely wrong. You remember that little tidbit from before about the barley and beans? You're now thinking about the boring history of their diet. A history that is less about indulgence and more about pure, practical fuel. Their diet, it turns out, was surprisingly similar to that of modern-day athletes who focus on endurance and muscle mass. They were often referred to as hordearii, which means barley eaters. This wasn't an insult, it was a description of their primary source of nutrition. The diet was largely vegetarian, a heavy mix of barley, beans, and other grains. This kind of diet would have given them the necessary carbohydrates for energy and muscle recovery, while also making them a bit soft. This softness, a quirky fact you learn, was a form of protection. The layer of subcutaneous fat would have protected their vital organs from shallow cuts, making the fights more dramatic and less immediately fatal. The diet was also supplemented with a drink made from plant ashes, probably from burnt wood or even burnt bone. This concoction was rich in calcium and other minerals, which would have helped strengthen their bones and heal fractures. This was a kind of ancient sports drink, a way to replenish their bodies after a grueling day of training or fighting. It's a testament to the Romans' practicality. They didn't have a modern understanding of nutrition, but they had a working knowledge of what it took to keep a fighting machine running. Historians still argue whether this diet was chosen for its nutritional benefits or simply because it was the cheapest and most abundant food source. The truth, you suspect, is a bit of both. The meals were served in the ludus in a communal dining hall. You can imagine the scene, men sitting together, eating their simple, repetitive meals. Their conversations probably a mix of bravado and quiet anxiety. It was a life of harsh discipline, and the food was a part of that discipline. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about performance. The fact that a vegetarian diet was a source of strength for these ancient warriors is a surprising and fringe tidbit of history. We tend to associate meat with strength, but for the gladiators, a plant-based diet was what fueled their endurance. You feel a little bit sleepy thinking about all that barley and beans. It's a boring but important detail that debunks a common myth. The gladiators weren't feasting like kings. They were eating like athletes, their bodies and minds honed for a single purpose. The next time you watch a movie about the gladiators, you can look at the brawny men in their loincloths and think, yeah, but I bet they had a lot of gas. A little joke to yourself to lighten the mood. The sun beats down on the arena floor. The gladiators are fueled by their simple, effective diet, are ready to perform. The sun is a fiery circle in the sky, and you feel a sleepy warmth settling over you. You've seen the animal hunts and the executions. You've seen the backstage world of the gladiators' training and the immense engineering of the Colosseum. But now, you are back to the main event. The reason you're here, the unfair matches. You're watching a new pairing, a different kind of mismatch, and you're starting to understand that the term gladiator fight is a gross oversimplification. These weren't just fights, they were highly specialized duels between two wildly different fighting styles. The most famous of these matchups, and the one that defines the concept of the unfair match, is the one you saw at the beginning of the day, the retiarius versus secutor. It's the ultimate contrast of offense and defense, of agility versus brute strength. The retiarius, with his net, trident, and dagger, was the epitome of speed and evasion. He had almost no armor, save for a shoulder guard, which made him nimble but incredibly vulnerable. His weapons were designed for distance and entanglement. His net was his main weapon, his unfair advantage, a tool for tripping and snaring his heavily armoured opponent. The secutor, or pursuer, was the perfect counter. He was a human tank, a heavy fighter with a smooth, egg-shaped helmet designed to prevent the net from catching on anything. His sword and shield were for close combat, a style that made him slow but nearly invulnerable to the retiarius's attacks. If he could just get close enough. This wasn't a fair fight in the sense of two evenly matched opponents. The entire point was the drama of the chase. You'd have the agile retiarius darting around the arena, using his speed and cunning to tire out the slower, more heavily armored Secutor. The crowd loved this kind of dynamic, this cat-and-mouse game. The Retiarius was the underdog, the agile hero, while the Secutor was the lumbering villain, a role he was perfectly suited for. The beauty of this matchup was that a quick, fatal blow was highly unlikely. The fight would go on and on, building tension and keeping the crowd on the edge of their seats. Historians still argue whether these specific matchups were always fair in their execution. Was the Retiarius sometimes given a head start? Was the Secutor's armor sometimes heavier to make the fight more of a spectacle? These are the kinds of fringe tidbits that make Roman history so endlessly fascinating. The truth is, the organizers wanted a good show, and a good show meant a long, drawn-out battle with a clear narrative of the light against the heavy, the fast against the slow. A boring, quick fight was bad for business. You can almost hear the soft scrapes of the Secutor's sandals on the sand, and the fluid, almost silent movements of the Retiarius. This is a clash of two different worlds, a perfect piece of theatre. The Retiarius's lack of armour made him a sympathetic character, a man of skill rather than strength. The Secutor's heavy armour made him seem inhuman, a force of nature. This was the genius of Roman entertainment. It wasn't just about the violence, it was about the story. The unfairness was the story. The fight is on. The Retiarius, your personal favourite now, is a whirlwind of motion. His bare feet slap against the sand, and he moves with a liquid grace that belies the brutal nature of his profession. He is a study in contrasts, a figure of minimal armour and maximum speed. You're focusing on him, on the details of his kit, which were specifically designed to make him the ultimate underdog. His equipment is a testament to the idea that a gladiator's life was less about a fair fight and more about a theatrical, specialized performance. His most iconic piece of equipment is his net, the reet. It's a large, weighted net, and he holds it in his left hand, ready to cast. It's not for killing, but for trapping. A tool of a fisherman rather than a soldier. This is a subtle but powerful detail. His opponent, the Secutor, is an armoured brute, and the net is his only hope. If he can entangle the Secutor, he can then use his other weapon to finish the job. The net is his one great equalizer, his unfair advantage. A quirky tidbit you recall is that the net was sometimes weighted with small lead balls, making it more effective at tangling and more dangerous when cast. His second weapon is the trident, the fascina. It's a long, three-pronged spear, and it's his primary offensive weapon. It's perfect for keeping his opponent at a distance, for jabbing and poking at the weak points in the Secutor's armour. It's a weapon of skill, not brute force. A quick thrust to the leg or the chest could disable his opponent, while a more powerful, well-placed strike could be fatal. The contrast between the heavy gladius of the Secutor and the light, agile trident of the Retiarius is the central theme of this fight. He also has a small dagger, the pugio, tucked into his belt. This is his last resort, a backup weapon for when his opponent gets too close. It's a sad, practical tool, a final, desperate attempt to save his life. The very presence of this small knife highlights his vulnerability. His only piece of armour is the gallerus, a metal shoulder guard that protects his neck and shoulder. It's a small, curved plate that sits on his left shoulder, the one that holds the net. It's his only defence against the crushing blows of the Secutor's sword. The lack of a helmet makes him more vulnerable but also more visible, which made him more sympathetic to the crowd. You can see his eyes, his expression, his fear and determination. This visibility made him a person, not a machine, a human being fighting for his life. Historians still argue whether the gallerus was always a full piece of metal or a simple leather guard. The reality is, it probably varied depending on the gladiator's status and the wealth of his lanista. You're seeing a fight, but you're also seeing a story. The Retiarius is the hero of the Roman masses. He's the clever underdog, the man who fights with wit and cunning rather than brute strength. His style is a reflection of the Roman fascination with the struggle between civilization and nature, order and chaos. He's the fisherman, and the Secutor is the beast he must trap. And in this moment, you're rooting for him. The man with the net, the Retiarius, is dodging, a blur of motion, but you now turn your attention to his opponent, the Secutor. He is the counterpoint, the heavy to the Retiarius's light, the fortress to his agility. The Secutor is a human tank. a gladiator designed for a single purpose, to pursue and defeat the retiarius. His name, Secutor, literally means pursuer, and you can see why. He lumbers forward, his feet a heavy, rhythmic thud against the sand, and you begin to understand the genius of his design, a study in a different kind of unfairness. His most defining feature is his helmet. It's a smooth, bronze dome, with a grille covering his face and only 2 tiny eye holes to see out of. It's an almost perfect piece of defensive engineering. The smooth surface prevents the retiarius's net from snagging, and the tiny eye holes prevent the trident from poking through. The helmet is his greatest asset and his greatest weakness. It protects him from the net and the trident, but it also severely limits his vision and airflow. You can almost hear his laboured breathing, the sound of a man fighting inside a metal oven. A quirky detail you recall is that the helmet was often incredibly hot, and the lack of air made the Secutor's endurance his biggest challenge. He was literally fighting against time, and against himself. A silent, internal battle that the crowd could only guess at. His armour is also a masterpiece of defence. He wears a manica, a heavy arm guard, on his right arm, a large rectangular shield, the scutum, and a shin guard. The ochria, on his left leg, is a wall of metal and leather, and you can see how his movements are slow and deliberate. He isn't designed for speed, he's designed for durability. He is the immovable object, and the retiarius is the irresistible force. The shield, in particular, is an incredible piece of equipment. It's a large, curved rectangle, and it's meant to cover his entire body. He holds it in front of him, and you can see how he uses it, not just for defense, but for offense, for pushing and shoving his opponent. His weapon is the gladius, a heavy, short sword. It's a blade designed for close-quarters combat, for thrusting and stabbing, not for swinging. It's the perfect weapon to use against the nearly naked retiarius, a blade that can find its mark in a moment of close contact. The Secutor's entire fighting style is a patient game of attrition. He has to wear down his opponent, tire him out, and then, when the retiarius is too exhausted to move, he can close in for the kill. Historians still argue whether the Secutor was truly a class of gladiator or a subclass of the murmillo, another type of heavy fighter. The truth is, the Roman classification system for gladiators was fluid and evolved over time, a boring but important detail. But whatever the name, the purpose was the same, to be the perfect foil for the quick and agile retiarius. The Secutor's life in the arena was a paradox of strength and vulnerability. He was protected from his opponent's weapons, but his own equipment put him at a disadvantage. He was a machine of war, but a machine that had to fight against its own limitations. And in this moment, you feel a flicker of pity for him, for the man inside the metal shell, fighting for his life in a suffocating suit of armour. With the Secutor and the retiarius locked in their high-stakes dance, you realise that this is just one of many types of gladiatorial matchups. The Romans, in their quest for spectacle, created a wide variety of gladiator classes, each with their own unique armour, weapons, and fighting styles. It's a fascinating, boring kind of taxonomy, a historical filing system of death. You're now seeing a new pair enter the arena, a different kind of mismatch, and you're getting a sense of the sheer diversity of the games. One of the new gladiators is a murmillo. He's a heavy fighter, similar to the Secutor in some ways, but with a different set of gear. His helmet is large and fish-crested, a quirky design that gives him his name, which comes from the Latin word for a saltwater fish. He carries a large rectangular shield, a scutum, and a short sword. A gladius. He's a fortress, a walking wall of iron and leather. His opponent is a Thraex, or Thracian. This is a light and quick gladiator, a perfect foil for the heavy murmillo. He wears a small, square shield, a palma, on his left arm, and he is armed with a curved sword called a sica. The Thraex's helmet is a distinctive one, with a wide brim and a griffin crest, a symbol of his homeland. His shins are protected by heavy leg guards, or ochria, which were often so heavy that the fighter would have to hobble a bit. Another common matchup was the hoplomachus against the murmillo. The hoplomachus was a highly armoured gladiator who was armed and armoured like a Greek hoplite. He wore a heavy breastplate, a crested helmet, and shin guards. His weapon was a long spear and a round shield, the hoplon. The fight was a reenactment of the Roman victory over the Greeks, a symbolic clash of civilizations. This was a classic example of how the games were used as a form of imperial propaganda, a way of celebrating Rome's military triumphs. Historians still argue about the exact origins and purpose of each gladiator type. Were they based on foreign enemies, or were they simply created for theatrical purposes? The truth is, it was probably a mix of both. The gladiator classes were a way of creating a narrative, a story of the Roman warrior defeating the barbarian, but they were also a way of keeping the games interesting, of creating new and exciting matchups. A fringe tidbit you recall is that some gladiators, like the Sagittarius, or archer, were even armed with bows and arrows, though they were likely used in animal hunts or reenactments rather than in one-on-one combat with other gladiators. You can hear the crowd's reaction to the different fighters. They have their favourites, their champions, and their villains. The Murmillo is a classic hero, a powerful warrior fighting for glory. The Thraex is the underdog, the quick and clever fighter who must use his wits to defeat a superior opponent. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of violence, it was a stage for a cast of characters, a world of heroes and villains, a world that was all too real. The fight between the Murmillo and the Thraex is over, and you see something new. The defeated Murmillo is helped to his feet. He's not dead, he's injured, but he's alive. You're now thinking about a different kind of history, a less glamorous one. The history of Roman medicine. The life of a gladiator was short, yes, but it was also a life of constant injuries, and the Romans had to find a way to keep their valuable human assets alive. The medical care available to gladiators was surprisingly advanced, a boring but fascinating fact that you are now considering. You imagine a small, cramped room, a clinic of sorts, just behind the arena. The air smells of medicinal herbs, and you can hear the low moans of the injured. This is the realm of the Medici, the gladiators' doctors. These men were highly skilled, and they were a vital part of the gladiator schools. They were paid well, and were often considered the best doctors in Rome. A fringe tidbit that seems almost contradictory, given the low social status of their patients. Their specialty was trauma medicine, and they were experts at setting bones, stitching wounds, and performing rudimentary surgeries. The medical knowledge of the Romans, based on the work of the Greeks, was a mix of practical experience and superstition. They had an understanding of anatomy, and they knew how to treat different types of injuries. You can almost see a doctor examining a wound, his hands quick and practiced. He would use a variety of tools, including scalpels, bone saws, and forceps, all made of bronze or iron. They would also use a variety of salves and poultices made from herbs and other natural ingredients. They knew how to stop bleeding and how to prevent infection, and they would often use a combination of wine and warm water to cleanse a wound. A quirky detail you recall is that gladiators had their wounds cauterized with a hot iron, a terrifying but effective way to prevent infection. The Roman doctors, however, had their limits. They had no understanding of germs or bacteria, and many of their treatments were based on a belief in a balance of the body's humours, a Greek theory that was based on the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This was a scholarly debate that wasn't debated at all. It was accepted as fact. This limited their ability to treat deep infections and internal injuries. A gladiator who suffered a fatal wound often had no chance of survival, no matter how skilled his doctor was. You can hear the soft murmur of the doctor's voice as he treats the injured Murmillo. He is a healer in a world of violence, a man of peace in a place of war. The gladiator's survival is not just a matter of life and death, it's a matter of money. The Lanistae wanted to keep their gladiators alive to fight another day, and the doctors were an essential part of that business model. You watch as the gladiator is carried away, his life in the hands of a man with a scalpel and a pouch of herbs. The fight is over, but the boring, quiet history of his survival has just begun. The wounded gladiator is gone, and the arena is being prepared for the next event. The quiet moments between the fights are a good time to reflect on the psychological toll of the games. You're no longer just looking at the violence, but at the mental state of the men who were forced to live it. This is a very boring but deeply human part of the history, the psychology of the games. You consider the mental fortitude required of both the gladiators and the audience. A strange and complex relationship built on a foundation of ritualized violence. For the gladiator, the psychological demands were immense. You had to be a warrior, an athlete, and a performer all at once. You were a slave. But you had to carry yourself with a kind of dignity, a sense of honor. The training was designed not just to hone your body, but your mind. You were taught to accept death, to be brave in the face of it, and to show no fear. This was a form of psychological conditioning, a way of turning a man into an asset, a piece of property that could perform under extreme pressure. A quirky detail you recall is that gladiators would sometimes have a kind of pre-fight ritual, a prayer or a small offering to a god, a way of finding some peace before the chaos. This was a private moment of humanity in a very public, inhuman space. The psychology of the audience was just as complex. They were there for the spectacle, yes, but they were also there to see a certain kind of drama play out. They wanted to see courage, skill, and a noble death. A gladiator who fought well, even in defeat, was respected. A gladiator who showed fear was scorned. The crowd was the ultimate judge, a fickle but powerful force that could determine your fate. The games were a kind of moral theatre, a place where the Romans could project their values onto a public stage. They were a people who valued discipline, courage, and a willingness to die for a cause. And the gladiators embodied these values, even as they were forced into their roles. Historians still argue whether the crowd's desire for violence was a sign of a sick society or simply a natural human fascination with death and survival. The truth, you suspect, is somewhere in the middle. We are, after all, a species that is drawn to stories of conflict and resolution. The Colosseum was a place where those stories were told in the most visceral way possible. It was a kind of therapy, a place where people could process their own fears about death and fate, and in a way, feel a little more in control. It was a reminder that life was short and brutal, but that there was still room for courage and honor. You can almost feel the collective breath of the crowd, the wave of shared emotion that ripples through the stands. It's a powerful, almost spiritual feeling. And you understand why the Romans were so obsessed with the games. The Colosseum was a place where they could feel alive. Even as they watched men die, it was a place of deep, human emotion, a place where fear and courage, life and death, all came together in a kind of grotesque ballet. The show is about to resume, but you're no longer just a spectator, you're a student of the human mind, and you're watching a masterclass in ancient psychology. The fight has ended, and this time, the Murmillo is victorious. He stands over his defeated opponent, his chest heaving, his sword lowered. The emperor gives the sign for mercy, and the Thrax is helped to his feet, a clear sign that he will live to fight another day. But you're thinking about the other outcome, the one that happens more often than not. You're thinking about the life of a gladiator after his career ends, whether it ends in death or in retirement. This is the boring Gladiators, but deeply human. History of a gladiator's afterlife, for a gladiator. There were two possible paths to a new life, death, or the rare but celebrated path of retirement. Let's start with the more common one. A gladiator's death was often a grim affair. If he was killed in the arena, his body would be dragged out through a special gate, the Porta Libitinensis, named after Libitina, the Roman goddess of funerals. His body would be taken to the spoliarium, a room where his armor and weapons would be stripped from him. The body itself would be disposed of, likely without a proper burial, a final indignity for a man who had been a hero just moments before. This was a grim and unceremonious end for a man who was, in his own way, a celebrity. The other path, the more hopeful one, was retirement. A gladiator who fought well and survived for a long time could earn his freedom. An event known as the manumissio. He would be given a wooden sword, the rudi, a symbol of his retirement from the arena. This was a moment of immense celebration, a public declaration of a man's freedom. A quirky tidbit you recall is that some gladiators were so famous and well off that they would go on to become lanistae themselves, owners of their own gladiator schools. This was the ultimate rags to riches story. a testament to the fact that even a slave in Roman society could, with a mix of luck and skill, rise to a position of power and wealth. Historians still argue about how often this happened. Was it a common occurrence, or was it a rare event? A kind of lottery ticket that only a few lucky gladiators ever won. The truth is, the odds were stacked against them. The life of a gladiator was short and dangerous, and most of them died long before they ever had a chance to earn their freedom. But the possibility, however small, was always there, and it was a powerful motivator. The Roman Empire was a brutal place, but it was also a place where a man could, in a twisted way, find a kind of social mobility. You can almost feel the weight of the rudis, the wooden sword, in your hand. It's a simple object, but it's a symbol of a life lived, a life fought for, and a life won. It's the ultimate trophy, a piece of wood that meant more than any amount of gold. A retired gladiator would live out the rest of his days as a free man, respected for his bravery, and a walking legend. He was a living testament to the power of the games, a human success story in a world of casual death. You close your eyes, and you feel a strange sense of peace. The boring, difficult history of a gladiator's life has a happy ending for some, a fact that is both surprising and strangely comforting. The victorious gladiator stands on the arena floor, a brief moment of quiet triumph before the next match begins. You've been thinking about the individuals, the gladiators themselves, but now you're considering their collective lives. You're now thinking about the existence of gladiator unions, or collegia. This is a boring but deeply fascinating piece of history. The idea that these enslaved men, with almost no rights, were able to organize themselves into something that resembled a union. These collegia were a form of guild or fraternal organization. They weren't a true union in the modern sense. They couldn't bargain for better wages or working conditions, but they served a vital purpose for the gladiators. They were a support system, a social and financial network that provided a safety net for a profession where life was cheap and death was always just a sword's length away. A fringe tidbit you recall is that these collegia often included not just the gladiators themselves, but also their doctors, trainers, and other support staff. A testament to how these organizations were a kind of extended family. The primary purpose of the collegia was to ensure a proper burial for their members. As we saw, a gladiator's body was often unceremoniously disposed of, but if he was a member of a collegium, he was guaranteed a dignified funeral, a proper burial, and a tombstone. This was an incredibly important thing for the Romans. A proper burial was a matter of honor and a way of ensuring that the soul found peace in the afterlife. The tombstone would often list the gladiator's name, his fighting record, and the name of his collegium, a public display of his fame and a sign that he was not forgotten. The collegia also provided a kind of insurance policy. If a gladiator was injured and could no longer fight, the collegium would provide him with some financial support. This was a way of ensuring that a man who had given his life for the games was not simply cast aside when he was no longer useful. It was a form of mutual aid, a way for these men to care for each other in a world that didn't care for them. Historians still argue about whether these collegia were formed by the gladiators themselves, or if they were a kind of paternalistic organization created by the lanistae to keep their human assets happy and productive. The truth, you suspect, is a bit of both. You can almost feel the quiet camaraderie of these men, the shared experience of training, fighting, and facing death together. The collegia were a way of creating a sense of community in a world that was designed to be isolating and dehumanizing. They were a reminder that even in the most brutal of professions, there was still room for a sense of honor and belonging. A quirky detail you recall is that some of these collegia were even named after their favorite gods, a way of giving a spiritual dimension to their brutal lives. These were men who were a part of something larger, something that gave their short, difficult lives a kind of meaning. You close your eyes, and you can almost hear the quiet, whispered agreements. The promises of men to a proper burial. This is a side of Roman history that is not about blood and guts, but about dignity and honor. The last match of the afternoon is over, and the crowd is starting to file out. But you linger, and you think about something you've only heard whispers about, the role of women in the arena. This is a rare, but important, piece of boring history. The story of the gladiatrices. This is not a common story, and it is shrouded in historical debate. but it's a fascinating one. While the vast majority of gladiators were men, there is evidence that women did, on rare occasions, fight in the arena. These women were not fighting men, they were fighting each other, or fighting wild animals. The accounts of gladiatrices are rare and often come from Roman writers who were hostile to the idea. They were often portrayed as being scandalous and unwomanly, but the fact remains that they existed. You can almost see them, dressed in the same gear as their male counterparts, fighting with the same ferocity. One of the most famous pieces of evidence for the existence of gladiatrices is a relief from Halicarnassus in modern-day Turkey. It shows two female gladiators fighting each other. Their names are given as Amazon and Achillea, a reference to the mythical Amazons, a nod to their unconventional role. The relief shows them in a kind of stalemate, a draw, which suggests that their fights were judged on the same criteria as the men's, a sign of skill and honour. This is a scholarly debate that is now largely settled. The evidence suggests that they did exist, even if they were a rare phenomenon. Why did they fight? The reasons are a matter of historical debate. Some were likely slaves, forced into the arena just like their male counterparts. Others may have been women of low social status who chose to fight for fame and money, just like the male gladiators who chose to live a life of celebrity. A quirky tidbit you recall is that Emperor Domitian, the emperor who built the Hypogeum, was known to stage fights between female gladiators at night, with the light of torches illuminating the arena. This was a private spectacle, a sign of his immense power and a reflection of his peculiar tastes. The existence of gladiatrices challenges our modern conception of Roman society. We tend to think of Roman women as being confined to the home, but the truth is that Roman society was more complex and more fluid than we imagine. The gladiatrices were a fringe element, a minority, but their existence shows that the boundaries of Roman gender roles were not as rigid as we think. It's a boring but deeply fascinating piece of history. The idea that a woman could, for a brief moment, transcend her social status and become a warrior, a hero, a spectacle. You close your eyes, and you can almost hear the soft cheers of a crowd, not for a man, but for a woman, fighting for her life in a man's world. The Colosseum is quiet now. The crowd's gone. The sand smoothed over. You're no longer in Rome, but in your mind. You are travelling across the vast Roman Empire. The games were not a local Roman phenomenon, they were a global one. The love of gladiatorial combat was exported to every corner of the empire, a boring but important piece of history that shows how Roman culture spread. Wherever the Romans went, they built amphitheatres, from Spain to Turkey, from Britain to North Africa. The ruins of these arenas can still be found. They are a physical testament to the far reach of the Roman Empire and the deep-seated cultural obsession with the games. You can imagine a crowd in a small Roman town in Gaul, their cheers just as loud and their betting just as fierce as the ones in Rome. The show was the same, the gladiator classes were the same, and the rules were the same. It was a kind of cultural consistency, a shared experience that connected the citizens of the empire. The gladiators themselves were often from the conquered territories, a mix of Britons, Gauls, Germans, and Africans. They were a living, breathing testament to the empire's military might, a grim souvenir from a conquered land. Their lives and deaths in the arena were a constant reminder of Rome's power, a piece of propaganda that was a lot more visceral than a statue or a coin. A quirky detail you recall is that some of these foreign gladiators became incredibly popular, their different fighting styles and unique appearances making them celebrities in their own right. A German barbarian with a heavy sword might have been the equivalent of a modern-day MMA fighter with a unique style. Historians still argue about whether the games were a tool of forced cultural assimilation or a source of genuine entertainment for the local populations. The truth is, it was likely a bit of both. The games were a way of teaching the conquered peoples Roman values, the importance of courage, discipline, and the willingness to die for a cause. But they were also genuinely thrilling. The local people, who had their own traditions of combat, were likely fascinated by the Roman way of war, a new and exciting form of spectacle. You can almost feel the desert sun on your face as you stand in the ruins of an amphitheater in Tunisia. You can almost hear the roar of a crowd in a Roman town in England. The games were a universal language, a language of violence and spectacle that was understood by everyone, from the lowliest slave to the most powerful senator. They were a sign that you were in a Roman land, a place where Roman law and Roman culture held sway. The Colosseum in Rome was the heart of the empire, but its pulse, its rhythm of violence and spectacle, could be felt in every corner of the world. The boring history of the game's expansion is a fascinating story of cultural dominance and the power of entertainment to shape a civilization. The Roman Empire eventually fell, and with it, the gladiatorial games faded into history. The Colosseum, which had been the vibrant heart of the city, became a shell of its former self. You are no longer in the bustling city of ancient Rome, but in the quiet, reflective present. You're looking at the Colosseum not as a place of violence and spectacle, but as a ruin, a monument to a lost world. This is the boring, but essential history of the Colosseum's long and gradual decline. After the last gladiatorial games were held in the 5th century CE, the Colosseum fell into disuse. The once magnificent structure was no longer a place of entertainment, but a quarry for centuries. Romans would come and strip the building of its materials, the beautiful marble facade, the seats, and even the iron clamps that held the stones together were all taken to be used in other buildings. You can still see the holes where the iron clamps were pried out. A testament to a long and boring history of salvage, the Colosseum was plundered for its wealth, and it was a source of building material for some of Rome's most famous structures, including St. Peter's Basilica. The Colosseum was also repurposed. In the medieval era, a wealthy Roman family turned it into a fortress, a walled city within the city. The archways were bricked up, and a small community lived inside the walls, a strange, forgotten city of people living in the ruins of a monument to entertainment. Later, it became a religious site, a shrine to the Christian martyrs who were believed to have died there. This is a topic of scholarly debate, as we'll discuss later, but it was a crucial part of the Colosseum's post-Roman history. A quirky detail you recall is that at one point, in the 16th century, the Pope even considered turning it into a wool factory, a bizarre fate for such a magnificent building. The decline of the Colosseum was a slow, gradual process, punctuated by natural disasters. Earthquakes would shake the structure, causing entire sections to collapse. The most famous of these was a massive earthquake in 1349, which caused the entire outer ring on the south side to collapse, leaving the Colosseum with its iconic, jagged, half-destroyed look. These natural events, combined with the constant plundering for materials, turned the Colosseum into the ruin we know today. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for the decline of the games and the Colosseum. Was it the rise of Christianity, which was hostile to the pagan rituals of the games? Was it the economic decline of the Roman Empire, which made it impossible to fund such lavish spectacles? Or was it simply a loss of interest on the part of the Roman people? The truth is, it was likely a combination of all three. The Colosseum's afterlife is a boring but important story of a building that was a mirror of its society. From its glorious rise to its slow, quiet decline, it stands today as a reminder that nothing, not even the grandest empire, is built to last forever. The Colosseum stands now as a place of quiet reflection, but for a long time, it was believed to be a site of Christian martyrdom. You're now thinking about this specific piece of the boring history of the Colosseum, the debate over whether Christians were truly executed here. This is a topic of intense scholarly debate, one that has been ongoing for centuries. The popular image of Christians being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum is a powerful one, and it is a cornerstone of Christian tradition. The stories of saints and martyrs who died in the arena have been passed down for generations. The Colosseum was eventually consecrated by the Catholic Church as a holy site, a place where so many Christians had supposedly given their lives for their faith. A large cross and a series of stations of the cross were erected inside the arena, and it became a place of pilgrimage. This is a powerful, emotional, and very human story. However, historians still argue about the veracity of these claims. While there is no doubt that Christians were persecuted and executed by the Roman Empire, there is very little hard, archaeological or textual evidence that these executions took place in the Colosseum on a large scale. Roman writers who documented the games, and there were many, rarely, if ever, mention Christians as being a specific group of people executed in the arena. The Roman historian Tacitus, for example, mentions that Nero punished Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, but he describes their deaths as taking place in Nero's gardens, not in the Colosseum. A quirky detail you recall is that many of the Noxii executions were, in fact, mythological reenactments, and the victims were criminals, not a specific religious group. The scholarly debate is a complex one. Some historians argue that the silence of the Roman writers is not proof that the executions didn't happen. They argue that Christians were a fringe group at the time, and their deaths would not have been important enough for Roman historians to record. Other historians argue that the Christian martyrdom stories were created later in the medieval era to give the faith a more heroic and dramatic past. They were a way of inspiring the faithful and giving a new, sacred meaning to a pagan monument. The truth, you suspect, is somewhere in the middle. It's likely that a few Christians were executed in the arena, but the idea of a mass, organized slaughter of Christians in the Colosseum is likely a later embellishment. The boring history of this debate is a beautiful one. In a way, it shows how history is not just about facts and figures, but about belief and narrative. The Colosseum, in its afterlife, became a monument to faith, a place where people could come and reflect on the sacrifices of the early Christians. The cross in the center of the arena stands as a symbol of this belief, a quiet defiance of the violence that once took place there. The Colosseum is a physical reminder that history is a living thing, a story that is constantly being told and retold. You're out of the Colosseum, back in the quiet of your mind. But you're now thinking about a specific gladiator, a man whose name is more famous than any other. You're thinking about Spartacus. This is a story that is not a part of the Colosseum's history, but it is a part of the history of gladiators. And it is a story of resistance and rebellion, a boring but vital part of the Roman story. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who led a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. This wasn't a show in the arena, this was a war, a 3-year conflict that shook the foundations of the Roman Empire. The story of Spartacus is a powerful one, and it is a testament to the fact that even the lowest members of Roman society could rise up and fight for their freedom. A quirky detail you recall is that Spartacus was said to have been a Roman soldier who was captured and enslaved, which would have given him a unique set of skills for his rebellion. The rebellion began in 73 BCE, at a gladiator school in Capua. Spartacus and a small group of fellow gladiators, around 78 of them, broke out of the school and fled to Mount Vesuvius. There, they were joined by other runaway slaves, and their numbers grew quickly. This wasn't a trained army, it was a mob of desperate men, but they were led by a brilliant military strategist. Spartacus and his men defeated several Roman legions, and their rebellion became a serious threat to the Republic. Historians still argue about the true motives of Spartacus. Was he fighting to free all slaves in the Roman Republic, or was he simply fighting for his own freedom and the freedom of his men? The truth, you suspect, is somewhere in between. Spartacus was a man who saw an opportunity for freedom, and he took it. He was a gladiator, a slave, but he was also a leader, a man who inspired others to fight for a better life. The rebellion was eventually crushed by the Roman general Crassus. But the legend of Spartacus lived on. The legacy of Spartacus is a powerful one. He became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and a hero to a new generation of revolutionaries. His name was used as a rallying cry by slaves and oppressed people throughout history. The boring history of his rebellion is a thrilling one. A story of an underdog who, for a brief moment, was able to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. The story of Spartacus is a reminder that even in the most brutal of systems, the human desire for freedom can never be completely extinguished. You've heard about Spartacus, and you've seen the bloody spectacle of the gladiatorial games, but you're now returning to the very beginning of the Colosseum's day. The gladiatorial matches were the main course, but the animal hunts, the venationes, were a show in their own right, a show that was just as brutal and just as steeped in Roman propaganda. You're thinking now about the spectacle of the wild animal hunts, a boring, but vital, part of the Colosseum's history. The venationes were more than just a simple hunt. They were a carefully choreographed show, a way of demonstrating Rome's power over nature. The animals were not just random beasts. They were exotic creatures from the farthest corners of the empire, lions from North Africa, bears from Britain, leopards from the Near East, and even elephants from Syria. These hunts were a celebration of Rome's military might, a public declaration that the empire had conquered not just its enemies, but the natural world itself. A quirky detail you recall is that sometimes the animals would be decorated with jewels or ribbons, a strange and unsettling mix of beauty and death. The hunts were often highly theatrical. The arena would be decorated with trees, rocks, and other props to create a realistic landscape, a kind of ancient zoo that was a lot more dangerous. The hunters, the bestiarii, were not gladiators in the traditional sense. They were specially trained men who fought the animals with spears and bows. Their fights were not meant to be fair, they were meant to be a show, a display of skill and courage. The crowd would cheer for the hunters, for the men who were bringing down the great beasts of the world. Historians still argue about the number of animals that were killed in the Colosseum. Some ancient sources claim that on a single day, thousands of animals were slaughtered. While these numbers are likely exaggerated for dramatic effect, there is no doubt that the number was in the hundreds. The demand for these exotic animals was so great that it led to the extinction of some species in North Africa. The Roman thirst for spectacle was a powerful and destructive force, a fact that is both sad and fascinating. The spectacle of the Venationes was a powerful piece of propaganda. It was a way of telling the Roman people that their empire was strong, that it was a force that could not be stopped. The animals were a symbol of the wild, of the untamed world, and their deaths in the arena were a sign that Rome had brought order to chaos. You can almost feel the dust and the blood in the air, the roar of the crowd, and the terror of the animals. It's a powerful, unsettling image, a reminder of a society that was both highly sophisticated and incredibly brutal. The boring history of the animal hunts is a story of power, spectacle, and a strange mix of human cruelty and artistry. The wild animal hunts were a spectacle, but you're now thinking about the boring history of how the animals got there. The logistics of animal acquisition for the Roman Colosseum were a staggering feat, a massive undertaking that required a vast network of hunters, traders, and sailors. This wasn't a trip to the local pet store, this was a global operation of capturing, transporting, and managing dangerous, exotic animals. First, there was the hunt itself. The Romans didn't just stumble upon these animals. They had professional hunters who would travel to the farthest reaches of the empire to capture them. These men, often locals who knew the terrain, would use a variety of methods to capture the animals alive. They would use nets, pits, and traps to capture large animals like lions and bears, and smaller animals like panthers and leopards would be captured in cages. This was an incredibly dangerous job, and you can only imagine the skill and courage it took to capture a wild beast without killing it. A quirky detail you recall is that some animals, like ostriches, were so prized that they were transported in special cages with padded floors to prevent them from injuring themselves. The next step was transportation. Once captured, the animals were loaded onto ships and transported across the Mediterranean. The journey would have been a long and arduous one, and the animals would have to be fed and cared for along the way. Historians still argue about the methods the Romans used to keep the animals calm during the journey. Were they drugged? Were they kept in darkness? The truth is, the Romans were masters of animal husbandry, and they would have used every trick in the book to ensure that their valuable cargo arrived in Rome alive and in fighting shape. Once the animals arrived in Italy, they would be housed in special holding pens outside of Rome, where they would be cared for by professional handlers, the bestiarii. They would be fed and watered, and they would be trained. Not to fight, but to be a part of the show. They would be taught to enter and exit the arena, and they would be conditioned to the sounds of the crowd. This was a long and boring process, a kind of ancient animal training that was essential to the spectacle. The final step was the journey from the holding pens to the Colosseum itself. The animals would be loaded onto carts and paraded through the streets of Rome, a kind of pre-show that would get the public excited for the main event. You can imagine the scene, the roar of the lions, the trumpeting of the elephants, and the crowds of people lining the streets to get a glimpse of these exotic creatures. This was a spectacle in itself, a testament to the fact that Rome had bent the natural world to its will. The boring history of animal acquisition is a story of incredible logistics, a testament to the Romans' obsession with entertainment. No matter the cost, the wild animals have arrived in Rome, and the spectacle is just hours away. But you're now thinking about the boring, dangerous lives of the people who worked with them every day. These are the animal handlers, the bestiarii. They are not the ones who fight the animals in the arena, but the ones who live with them. who feed them, and who prepare them for their grand entrance. Theirs is a story of peril and courage, a piece of fringe history that is often overlooked. The bestiarii were a strange mix of trainers, caretakers, and animal wranglers. They were responsible for the daily care of the exotic animals in the holding pens outside the city. This was a dangerous job, and it required a deep understanding of animal behavior. You can imagine a man, a professional bestiarius, standing outside a cage, a long pole in his hand, a look of calm concentration on his face. He's not there to fight the animal, but to ensure its health and safety, to make sure it's ready for the show. A quirky detail you recall is that some of these men were so skilled that they could even get a wild animal to perform simple tricks, a testament to their patience and their bond with the creatures. Their job was also to get the animals from the pens to the arena. They would have to guide the beasts through the crowded streets of Rome, a task that would have required a great deal of skill and courage. They would use carts and ropes to keep the animals contained, and they would use whips and prods to keep them moving. It was a chaotic, noisy, and incredibly dangerous process. And you can only imagine the kind of chaos that would ensue if a lion were to escape into the city. The bestiarii were not the glorious gladiators, but they were a vital part of the spectacle. They were the unsung heroes of the arena, the men who made sure the show went on without a hitch. Their lives were filled with a kind of quiet peril, a daily risk that was not a part of the gladiator's life of flash and glory. They were a part of the boring history of the Colosseum, the essential labour that made the spectacle possible. Historians still argue about the social status of these men. Were they slaves? Were they free men who chose a dangerous profession for a good wage? The truth, you suspect, is a mix of both. They were men who had a specialised skill, a knowledge of animals that was incredibly valuable. Their lives were a paradox of danger and routine, a mix of quiet work and sudden, terrifying moments. You feel a strange sense of respect for these men, for their quiet courage, for their ability to work with and understand creatures that were so different from themselves. The sun is now at its peak, and you can almost hear the soft, nervous growls from the dark corridors of the Hypogeum, and you know that the bestiarii are doing their job, preparing the beasts for the show. The wild animal hunts are over, and the arena is being prepared for the main event. But you're no longer thinking about the spectacle. You're now thinking about the boring, foundational history of how this all started. The games were not a permanent fixture of Roman life from the beginning. They had a much more sombre origin, a piece of fringe history that is often forgotten, the munus and the funeral games. A munus was a public duty, a civic obligation. The first known gladiatorial combat in Rome took place in 264 BCE. It was held by Decimus Junius Brutus to honour his deceased father. He arranged for 3 pairs of gladiators to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium. This was not for entertainment. It was a religious rite, a kind of human sacrifice to honour the dead. The Romans believed that the blood of a fallen warrior would appease the spirits of the deceased. A boring but important piece of religious history. The fights were grim and private affairs, a far cry from the grand spectacle of the Colosseum. Over time, the funeral games became more elaborate. Wealthy Romans would host larger and more extravagant games to honour their deceased relatives. This was a way of displaying their wealth and status, a kind of ancient funeral that was part religious ceremony and part public relations. The number of gladiators would grow from a handful to 100, and the location would shift from the private forum to the public amphitheater. The games were no longer a private affair, but a public one. The religious origin was still there, but it was being slowly subsumed by the love of spectacle. Historians still argue about the exact point at which the games shifted from a religious rite to a form of public entertainment. The truth, you suspect, is that it was a slow, gradual process, a blurring of the lines between sacred and profane. The Roman people loved a good show, and the politicians and wealthy elites were more than happy to provide it. The games were a perfect blend of duty and distraction, a way of fulfilling a religious obligation while also gaining political popularity. A quirky detail you recall is that the very word gladiator comes from the word gladius, meaning sword, a nod to the fact that these men were primarily defined by their weapon. The history of the games is a story of a ritual that outgrew its origins. It started as a solemn and quiet affair, a private act of honour for the dead, but it became a public, noisy, and bloody spectacle that was a cornerstone of Roman society. The Colosseum, in a way, was a giant tombstone, a monument to the forgotten origins of the games. You feel a strange sense of quiet respect for those first gladiators, the men who fought not for a crowd's amusement, but for a solemn ritual for the dead. The boring history of the funeral games is a reminder that even the most brutal of traditions had a humble and deeply human beginning. The gladiators are making their way to the arena, their armor gleaming in the sun. But you're now thinking about the people who weren't there, the people who hated the games. This is the boring, but crucial, history of the moral arguments against the games. While the vast majority of Romans loved the spectacle, there were a few who spoke out against it. This is a story of philosophy versus popular culture, a conflict that is both ancient and modern. The moral arguments against the games came primarily from two sources: Roman philosophers and, later, early Christians. The Roman philosopher Seneca, for example, was a harsh critic of the games. He saw them as a debasing spectacle that turned men into beasts and corrupted the morals of the public. He famously wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius in which he described attending the games and being appalled by the mindless slaughter. He saw the games not as a test of courage, but as a form of social decay, a sign that the Roman soul was sick. He was not just against the violence, but against the casual cruelty, the lack of empathy that the games encouraged. Later, as Christianity rose in popularity, the arguments against the games became more religious. Early Christian writers saw the games as a pagan ritual, a blood sacrifice that was an affront to their beliefs. They argued that the games were a source of idolatry and that they glorified death and violence, which were sins in their eyes. The Christian emperor Constantine, in 325 CE, made the first attempt to ban the games, though his edict was largely ignored. The games continued for another century, but the moral tide was turning against them. A quirky detail you recall is that a monk named Telemachus famously jumped into the arena in 404 CE to stop a gladiatorial combat, and he was stoned to death by the crowd. His death, however, is said to have led to the final banning of gladiatorial combat by Emperor Honorius. This is a boring but important story of a man who died for his beliefs. Historians still argue about the true motives of the critics of the games. Were they truly motivated by a sense of morality? Or were they simply a fringe minority who were out of touch with the popular culture of their time? The truth, you suspect, is a bit of both. The philosophers were a small, elite group who saw the games as a sign of a society in decline. The Christians were a growing force who saw the games as a rival religion, a rival way of life. The moral arguments against the games are a reflection of a deeper conflict in Roman society, a conflict between tradition and change. You're seeing a society that is a paradox. It is a society that can build magnificent aqueducts and roads, a society that can create a system of law that is still used today, but it is also a society that can cheer for a man being eaten by a lion. The moral arguments against the games are a reminder that even in the most brutal of times, there were always people who spoke out against cruelty, a fact that is both comforting and deeply human. The gladiators are now fighting, a new pair, a new mismatch, but you are now thinking about the boring history of the Colosseum's survival, the things that tried to tear it down. The Colosseum is a ruin, but it is a testament to its builders and to the forces that tried to destroy it. A story of natural disasters and human neglect. The first and most consistent threat to the Colosseum was earthquakes. Rome sits in a seismic zone, and over the centuries, the city has been shaken by numerous tremors. The most famous of these was in 1349, which caused a massive portion of the Colosseum's outer wall to collapse. You can still see the results of this earthquake, the jagged, broken face of the Colosseum. The earthquakes were a natural and powerful force, and the building, for all its strength, was no match for the shifting of the earth. The second great threat was human looting. The Colosseum was a monument to Roman power, but after the empire fell, it became a quarry. For centuries, Romans would come and take the stone, the marble, and the iron from the building. The holes you can still see in the stones are a testament to this, a physical reminder of the countless iron clamps that were pried out to be used for other purposes. This was a long and boring process of slow, deliberate destruction, a kind of unmaking that was as powerful as any earthquake. A quirky detail you recall is that the building was so thoroughly stripped that even the bronze statues that once adorned the top of the arches were melted down and used for other things. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for the decline of the Colosseum. Was it the earthquakes, or was it the looting? The truth, you suspect, is that it was a combination of both. The earthquakes would weaken the structure, and the looters would finish the job, taking the materials that were most valuable. The Colosseum's long, slow decline is a kind of paradox. It was built to be a permanent monument, a symbol of Rome's eternal power, but it became a symbol of its decline. The Colosseum stands today as a ruin, a kind of beautiful corpse. But in a way, its brokenness is a part of its story. It is a testament to the fact that nothing, not even the greatest empire in the world, can last forever. The boring history of the Colosseum's slow destruction is a powerful one, a story of a building that was unmade by the forces of nature and by the hands of men. The gladiators are back in the arena, but you're no longer in the public Colosseum. You are in a different place entirely, a small, private arena. You're thinking about a boring but interesting part of Roman history, the emperor's private spectacles. These were not the massive shows of the Colosseum, but smaller, more intimate affairs held for the emperor and his closest friends. You can almost feel the difference in the air. The crowd is not a mob of 50,000, but a small, select group of nobles and senators. Their voices a low murmur rather than a deafening roar. The arena is not a massive oval of stone, but a small, circular stage in the imperial palace. The fights are not for public consumption, but for the emperor's personal amusement. This was a form of private entertainment, a kind of ancient reality show that was reserved for the most powerful man in the world. These private spectacles were often more bizarre and more theatrical than the public games. Emperors, with their immense wealth and power, could afford to stage fights between unique and unusual combatants. A quirky detail you recall is that some emperors would stage fights between dwarfs or between women, not just because they were unusual, but because they were a powerful display of the emperor's ability to bend the world to his will, to create a spectacle that no one else could. These private games were a form of imperial propaganda, a way of showing the emperor's power to those who were closest to him. Historians still argue about the true nature of these private games. Were they a sign of a depraved and cruel emperor, or were they simply a form of entertainment that was a natural extension of the public games? The truth, you suspect, is a bit of both. The emperors were men who were used to getting what they wanted, and what they wanted was a new and more exciting form of entertainment. The private games were a way of satisfying that desire. They were also a way of showing their power to their closest circle. You can almost feel the hush in the room as a new pair of combatants enters the arena. They are not the hulking gladiators of the Colosseum, but a pair of small, nimble fighters. The emperor sits on his throne, his face impassive, a look of calm concentration on his face. He is the master of this small world, the ultimate arbiter of life and death. The boring history of the emperor's private spectacles is a story of power, privilege, and a kind of casual cruelty that is both fascinating and chilling. It is a reminder that in ancient Rome, the lines between public life and private life were often blurred, and that the desire for entertainment could lead to some truly bizarre and unsettling results. The private spectacle is over, Bede, and you're back in the public stands of the Colosseum. The crowd is getting restless, waiting for the next round of matches, but you're no longer thinking about the fights. You're thinking about the boring, everyday lives of the Romans who are sitting around you. How did the games, this brutal and magnificent spectacle, fit into their daily lives? The games were not a daily event. They were a special occasion, an event that was announced months in advance for the average Roman. A day at the Colosseum was a kind of holiday. It was a day off from work, a chance to be with friends and family. It was a day that was planned, and it was a day that was talked about for weeks afterward. The Colosseum was a kind of ancient water cooler, a place where people could share their experiences and talk about the latest gossip. You can almost hear the conversations around you, the excited chatter of people who are here for a rare and special treat. The games were also a part of the social fabric of the city. The wealthy and powerful would use the games as a way of currying favor with the public. They would sponsor the games, and they would hand out free food and wine, a form of public charity that was a powerful tool of political persuasion. The games were a way of cementing the social order, a kind of unspoken contract between the rulers and the ruled. The rulers would provide the people with entertainment and food, and in return, the people would give them their loyalty and their support. Historians still argue whether this was a form of political manipulation or a genuine expression of generosity. The truth, you suspect, is a mix of both. The games were also a kind of religious event. They were dedicated to the gods, and they were a way of honouring the Roman virtues of courage, discipline, and a willingness to die for a cause. The gladiators, in their own way, were a kind of living sacrifice, a way of honouring the gods with their blood. A quirky detail you recall is that before a fight, a priest would bless the arena, a strange and unsettling mix of religious piety and brutal violence. The boring history of the games is that they were a deeply integrated part of Roman life. They were a part of the social, political, and religious fabric of the city. They were a form of entertainment, yes, but they were also a form of communication. A way for the Romans to talk to each other and to their gods. You lean back and close your eyes. You can almost feel the rhythm of the city, the daily hum of life, and the way it all culminates in this one magnificent, violent, and glorious day. The gladiators are now a blur of motion, but you're no longer just seeing a fight. You're seeing the boring, fascinating history of the tourist economy that grew up around the Colosseum. The games were not just for the Romans, they were for the world. They were a destination event, and they created a bustling economy around the Colosseum. You can almost feel the press of the crowd, the mix of languages, the different styles of dress. People would travel from all over the empire to see the games. They would come from Gaul, from Greece, from Egypt, and from Britain. They were tourists, and they were here for the show. This created a thriving industry around the Colosseum. Vendors would sell food, drink, and souvenirs. You can almost see a man selling small clay models of gladiators or little oil lamps with images of famous fighters. A quirky detail you recall is that many of these souvenirs were mass-produced, a sign that the tourist economy was a well-oiled machine. The area around the Colosseum was a bustling hub of commerce. There were inns and taverns for the visitors, and there were shops that sold everything from clothes to spices. The games were a kind of economic engine, a powerful force that drove the local economy. The money that was spent by the tourists would trickle down to the local shopkeepers, the innkeepers, and the street vendors. It was a kind of ancient capitalism, a system that was based on the simple principle of supply and demand. Historians still argue about the exact number of tourists who visited Rome for the games. Was it a few thousand, or was it tens of thousands? The truth is, we don't know for sure, but the evidence suggests that the number was substantial. The games were a major draw, a reason to visit the Eternal City. They were a part of the Roman experience, a piece of the city's identity. The boring history of the Colosseum's tourist economy is a reminder that even in the most brutal of times, there was still a human desire for entertainment and for connection. The Colosseum was not just a place of death, it was a place of life, a place where people from all over the world could come together and share a common experience. You close your eyes, and you can almost feel the hum of the city, the low murmur of conversation, and the soft clinking of coins. The show is about to resume, but you're no longer just a spectator, you're a tourist, and you're seeing the boring, beautiful, and vibrant history of a city that was built for spectacle. The gladiators are back in the arena, and you are no longer thinking about the crowd or the economy. You are now thinking about the boring, specific history of their weapons and armor. Each gladiator class, from the heavy murmillo to the light retiarius, had a unique set of gear, a kind of ancient kit that was designed for a very specific purpose. This is a study in ancient military technology and its application in the name of entertainment. Let's start with the shields. The heavy fighters, like the murmillo and the secutor, carried a large, curved rectangular shield. The scutum, this was the same type of shield used by Roman legionaries, and it was a masterpiece of Roman engineering. It was made of layers of wood, covered in leather, with a metal boss in the center. It was heavy, and it was designed to protect the gladiator's entire body. The lighter fighters, like the thraex and the hoplomachus, carried a smaller, round or square shield, the palma. This was a shield that was designed for agility, not for protection. A quirky detail you recall is that the shields were often painted with colourful designs, which made them a kind of canvas for the gladiators' personality and allegiance. Next, the weapons. The most common weapon was the gladius, a short, heavy sword that was designed for thrusting and stabbing. It was a brutal and efficient weapon, and it was the primary weapon of the heavy fighters. The lighter fighters, like the Thraex, carried a sika, a curved, sickle-like sword that was perfect for slashing and disarming an opponent. The retiarius, as you know, carried a trident and a net, weapons that were a world away from the swords and spears of the other gladiators. This contrast was the point. It was a visual representation of the unfair match, the clash of two different worlds. Finally, the armour. The gladiators wore a mix of metal, leather, and fabric armour. The heavy fighters wore a manica, a heavy arm guard, and a ochria, a heavy shin guard. Their helmets, as you know, were heavy and full-faced. A kind of medieval knight's helmet that was a testament to Roman metalworking. The lighter fighters wore a simple loincloth, a sublegaculum, and their armour was minimal, a leather strap or a small piece of metal. This was a deliberate choice, a way of making the fight more dramatic and more dangerous. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of this armour. Was it designed to protect the gladiators, or was it designed to prolong the fight and make it more entertaining? The truth is, it was probably a mix of both. The armour was heavy and unwieldy, but it was also a crucial part of the gladiator's identity, a piece of his uniform that told the audience who he was and how he fought. The gladiators are a blur of motion, but you are no longer thinking about their equipment. You are now thinking about the fan culture of the Colosseum, a boring but fascinating history that is surprisingly similar to a modern-day sports fan. The Romans, like us, were obsessed with their champions, their rivalries, and their teams. The fan culture of the Colosseum was built around the gladiator schools, or ludi. Each school had its own colours, its own style, and its own stable of fighters. A fan would often pledge their loyalty to a specific school, and they would cheer for their gladiators with a fierce passion. You can almost see them now. The fans of one school wearing a specific colour, their chants and cheers a unified roar. The rivalries between the different schools were intense, and a fight between two gladiators from rival schools was a major event, a kind of Super Bowl of ancient Rome. The fans also had their own champions, their favourite fighters who they would follow from fight to fight. These champions were the superstars of their time, and their names were household words. You can almost hear the crowd chanting the name of a famous gladiator, a kind of ancient MVP chant. The fans would even keep track of their favourite gladiator's record, and they would discuss his wins and losses with the same passion as a modern-day sports fan. A quirky detail you recall is that some of the most dedicated fans would even paint graffiti on walls, praising their favourite gladiators and denouncing their rivals. This was a kind of ancient social media, a way for the fans to express their love for their heroes. Historians still argue about the social dynamics of this fan culture. Was it a way for the common people to feel a part of something, a way of feeling a sense of belonging in a society that was often impersonal and rigid? Or was it simply a form of entertainment, a way of making the games more interesting? The truth, you suspect, is a bit of both. The fan culture of the Colosseum was a way of creating a sense of community, a shared experience that connected people from all walks of life. It was a way of feeling a part of something larger, something that was both thrilling and deeply human. The boring history of the Colosseum's fan culture is a reminder that human beings, regardless of the time or the place, are drawn to stories of heroism and competition. The Colosseum was a stage, and the gladiators were the actors, but the fans were the ones who wrote the script. They were the ones who decided who was a hero and who was a villain. They were the ones who made the games more than just a spectacle of violence. They made them a story, and in this moment, you are a part of that story, a quiet fan in the stands, watching the show unfold. The gladiators are locked in their dance, but you're no longer thinking about the visual spectacle. You are now thinking about the boring, yet deeply important, history of the Colosseum's soundscape. The Colosseum was not a silent place, it was a symphony of sounds, a cacophony of human and animal noise that was as much a part of the spectacle as the violence itself. First, there was the roar of the crowd. It was a continuous, pulsating sound, a low hum that would rise to a deafening roar during a particularly good fight. It was the sound of 50,000 people reacting as one, a powerful and overwhelming force. You can almost feel the sound in your chest, a physical vibration that would have been impossible to ignore. A quirky detail you recall is that the Romans had a kind of chant, a rhythmic clap and stomp that would be used to show approval or disapproval. It was a way of amplifying the sound, of turning the crowd into a kind of musical instrument. Then, there were the sounds of the arena itself. You can hear the soft scrape of sandals on the sand, the heavy thud of a shield hitting the ground, the metallic ring of a sword on a helmet. These were the sounds of combat, the music of a life or death struggle. You can also hear the groans of the winches in the hypogeum as a cage is lifted to the arena floor, the low growl of a wild animal, and the creak of the gates as they open. These were the sounds of the behind-the-scenes work, the boring, essential noise that made the spectacle possible. Historians still argue about the acoustics of the Colosseum. Was it designed to amplify the sound of the crowd, or was it simply a happy accident of Roman engineering? The truth is, the Romans were masters of acoustics, and it is likely that the design of the Colosseum was a deliberate choice. The tiered seating and the shape of the arena would have acted as a kind of natural amplifier, a way of ensuring that every single person in the stands could hear the action. The boring history of the Colosseum's soundscape is a reminder that a spectacle is not just about what you see, it's also about what you hear. It's about the emotional experience, the way a sound can make you feel a part of something larger, the roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the growl of a lion. These were the sounds of a society at play. They were the sounds of a people who were in love with drama, with violence, and with a good show. And in this moment, you are listening to a very old and very boring piece of history. The gladiators are a blur of motion, but you are no longer thinking about them. You are now thinking about the boring, structural history of the Colosseum's seating arrangement. This was not a random affair. It was a physical representation of Roman social order, a powerful and subtle way of communicating who was important and who was not. The seating was arranged in a strict hierarchy, a kind of ancient class system made of stone. The front rows, the best seats in the house, were reserved for the most important people in Rome. The emperor had his own private box, a place of unparalleled luxury and a perfect view of the action. The senators, the most powerful men in Rome, had their own reserved seats, and their names were often carved into the stone. These were the men who ran the empire, and their position in the Colosseum was a reflection of their power. The next tier of seating was for the equestrian class, the wealthy businessmen and knights of Rome. Their seats were not as close to the action as the senators, but they were still a sign of their status. They were the men who ran the Roman economy, and their position in the Colosseum was a reflection of their wealth. The third tier was for the plebeians, the common people of Rome. Their seats were higher up and farther from the action, but they were still a part of the show. They were the backbone of the empire, and their presence in the Colosseum was a sign that they were a part of the Roman family. A quirky detail you recall is that women were often seated in a separate, lower section of the stands, a sign of their low social status. This was a clear example of how Roman society, for all its sophistication, was still deeply patriarchal. The final tier of seating was for the lowest members of Roman society, the poor and the slaves. Their seats were at the very top of the Colosseum, and their view of the action was the worst. They were the ones who were at the bottom of the social ladder, and their position in the Colosseum was a physical representation of their place in Roman society. Historians still argue about the exact rules of the seating arrangement. Were they strictly enforced, or was there some fluidity? The truth, you suspect, is that they were a mix of both. The rules were there, but there was also a way for a man to move up in the world, to earn a better seat through wealth or influence. The boring history of the Colosseum's seating arrangement is a story of power, status, and a society that was obsessed with its own hierarchy. It is a reminder that even in a place of casual death, the Romans found a way to create a system of order. You close your eyes, and you can almost feel the weight of the social hierarchy. A silent force that was just as powerful as the roar of the crowd. The gladiators are a blur of motion. But you are no longer just seeing a fight. You are now seeing the boring, political history of the games. The Colosseum was not a place of pure entertainment. It was a stage for imperial propaganda, a powerful and subtle way for emperors to project their power and generosity. The games were a tool of rule, a way of cementing the emperor's control over the masses. The first and most obvious form of propaganda was the spectacle itself. The games were a powerful display of the emperor's wealth and power. The ability to bring in thousands of exotic animals from all over the world, to stage massive naval battles, and to provide the people with free entertainment was a clear sign that the emperor was a man of immense resources. This was a way of telling the Roman people that their leader was strong and that he was a man who could provide for them. A quirky detail you recall is that some emperors would even throw silver or gold coins into the crowd, a kind of ancient rain of generosity that would create a chaotic scramble for the wealth. The games were also a way of projecting the image of a merciful ruler, as you've seen. The emperor had the final say over the fate of a defeated gladiator. The emperor could choose to spare a gladiator who had fought bravely, a powerful display of mercy that would earn him the love and respect of the crowd. This was a way of showing the people that their leader was not a tyrant, but a just and compassionate man. This was a form of political theatre, a way of shaping the public perception of the emperor. Historians still argue whether these acts of mercy were genuine or simply a cynical ploy for political gain. The truth is, it was likely a mix of both. The games were a way of keeping the people happy and distracted. The Roman poet Juvenal famously coined the phrase bread and circuses to describe the way the emperors kept the masses in line. By providing the people with free food and entertainment, the emperors could distract them from the more serious issues of politics and governance. The Colosseum was a kind of safety valve, a place where the people could let off steam and feel a part of something grand, something powerful. The boring history of the games as a form of imperial propaganda is a powerful one, a story of a society that was both obsessed with its own image and a master of political manipulation. It is a reminder that in ancient Rome, the lines between entertainment and politics were often blurred. You close your eyes, and you can almost feel the weight of the emperor's power, a silent force that was just as powerful as the roar of the crowd. The gladiators are a blur of motion, but you are no longer thinking about the violence or the politics. You are now thinking about the boring, human history of the Colosseum's unsung heroes. These are the men and women who worked behind the scenes, the people who made the show possible, but who never saw the glory. Their story is a reminder that a great spectacle is not just about the performers, but about the people who do the quiet, essential work. First, there were the doctors, the Medici, as you know. They were a vital part of the gladiator schools, and they were also on hand during the games. They were the ones who would rush into the arena after a fight to tend to the wounded. Their job was not to be a hero, but to be a healer, a man of quiet skill in a place of casual death. A quirky detail you recall is that these doctors were often paid based on the value of the gladiator they treated, a kind of ancient insurance policy. Then there were the builders and the engineers. The Colosseum, as you know, was a masterpiece of Roman engineering, but it was built by countless men and women who never saw their names carved into the stone. They were the ones who moved the stones, who mixed the concrete, and who created the complex system of pulleys and winches in the hypogeum. Their work was boring and repetitive, but it was essential to the show. A scholarly debate exists about the number of people who worked on the Colosseum and whether they were free men or slaves. The truth is, it was likely a mix of both, a massive undertaking that required a huge labour force. Finally, there were the thousands of anonymous workers who did the daily, essential work. There were the men who cleaned the cages, the ones who polished the armour, and the ones who raked the sand. These were the people who made the show go on, day after day, without any of the glory or the fame. Their lives were a mix of danger and routine, a quiet existence in the shadow of a grand and violent spectacle. The boring history of the Colosseum's unsung heroes is a powerful one. It is a reminder that a great spectacle is not just about the heroes and the villains, but about the people who do the quiet, essential work. They were the ones who built the stage, and they were the ones who cleaned up after the show. And in this moment you feel a deep and quiet respect for them. The gladiators are a blur of motion, but you are no longer just thinking about the people. You are now thinking about the boring, structural history of the Colosseum itself. We've talked about the grandeur, but there are some quirky, hidden architectural secrets, subtle engineering tricks that made the Colosseum a functional and imposing structure. This is a story of a building that was even more clever than it looked. First, let's talk about the awnings. The Romans had to contend with the intense Italian sun, and they had a solution, a massive canvas awning called the velarium. This was a huge cloth that could be stretched over the top of the arena, providing shade for the entire crowd. This was not a simple task. It required a team of sailors, who were experts in ropes and pulleys, to operate. A scholarly debate exists over how the velarium was rigged and operated. Was it a single piece of cloth, or a series of smaller pieces? The truth is, it was likely a series of sections, which would have made it easier to manage and adjust for the wind. The velarium was a massive, boring piece of engineering that made the Colosseum a more comfortable place to be. Next, the drainage system. The Colosseum, as you know, had a complex system for draining water. This was not just for the mock naval battles, but for the daily drainage of rainwater and the waste from the crowds. There was a network of drains and channels that would collect the water and funnel it into the city's sewer system. A quirky detail you recall is that the Romans were masters of sanitation, and the Colosseum was no exception. It had a constant flow of fresh water that was used to clean the latrines and to flush away the waste. This was a boring but essential part of the Colosseum's design, a part of its hidden genius. Finally, the elevators. We talked about the elevators in the Hypogeum, but let's talk about the details. These were not modern hydraulic elevators. They were powered by human and animal labor, and they were operated with a complex system of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights. They were used to bring the animals and the props to the arena floor, and they were a crucial part of the spectacle. The fact that the Romans could build such a complex system with their limited technology is a testament to their engineering prowess. The boring history of the Colosseum's hidden architectural secrets is a story of a building that was a lot more clever than it looked. A marvel of form and function, the Colosseum is now silent, the crowd is gone, and the sand is still. You're no longer in the violent heart of the Roman Empire, but in the quiet of its twilight. You're now thinking about the boring, essential history of the end of the gladiatorial games. The games did not end in a single, dramatic moment. They ended in a long, slow, and gradual decline, a kind of cultural fade to black that was as powerful as any violent climax. The first reason for the decline was the rise of Christianity. As you know, the early Christians were hostile to the pagan rituals of the games, and they saw them as a debasing spectacle that was a sin against God. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, the moral arguments against the games became more and more common. The emperors, who were now Christian, were under pressure to end the games. In 325 CE, Emperor Constantine issued an edict banning gladiatorial combat, but it was largely ignored. The games continued, but their popularity was on the decline. A scholarly debate exists about whether the decline of the games was a result of Christian morality or simply a loss of public interest. The truth is, it was a mix of both. The games were a part of a pagan world, and as that world faded, so did the games. The second reason for the decline was economic. The Roman Empire was in a state of slow decline, and the immense cost of staging the games became a major burden on the state's resources. The money that was once used to fund the games was now needed for other things, like defending the empire from barbarian invasions. The games were no longer a priority, and they became less and less frequent. The emperors and the wealthy elites were no longer willing or able to spend a fortune on a show that was no longer as popular as it once was. A quirky detail you recall is that the last recorded gladiatorial combat in the city of Rome took place in 435 CE, a quiet, almost forgotten end to a long and bloody history. The final end of the games was not in a violent climax, but in a quiet whimper. The games simply stopped. The crowds no longer came, the emperors no longer sponsored them, and the gladiators were no longer trained. The Colosseum, which had been the vibrant heart of the city, became a shell of its former self. It was plundered for its stone and its iron, and it became a monument to a forgotten world. The boring history of the end of the gladiatorial games is a powerful one. It is a story of a cultural institution that was unmade not by a single, dramatic moment, but by the slow, quiet, and inevitable forces of history. The Colosseum stands today as a reminder that even the most powerful of empires and the most popular of spectacles are not built to last forever. The Colosseum is now a quiet ruin, a monument to a lost world. The crowds are gone, the gladiators are silent, and the sand has long since been covered by dust and grass. You're no longer in the past, but in the present, and you're now thinking about the boring, eternal history of the Colosseum's legacy. This is a story of how a monument to violence became a symbol of something else entirely. The Colosseum stands today as a symbol of Roman engineering and architectural genius. It is a testament to the fact that a society, with enough will and resources, can build something that will last for millennia. It is a source of pride for the people of Rome, and it is a destination for millions of tourists from all over the world. People come not to see the violence, but to marvel at the ingenuity, to walk in the footsteps of a lost empire. A scholarly debate exists about whether the Colosseum should be preserved as a ruin or rebuilt to its former glory. The truth is, its beauty lies in its brokenness, its scars a reminder of its long and difficult history. The Colosseum is also a symbol of Christian martyrdom. As you know, the evidence for a mass slaughter of Christians in the Colosseum is weak, but the belief is a powerful one. The Colosseum, in its afterlife, became a monument to faith, a place where people could come and reflect on the sacrifices of the early Christians. The cross in the center of the arena stands as a symbol of this belief, a quiet defiance of the violence that once took place there. This is a boring but powerful piece of history, the story of how a monument to pagan brutality became a place of Christian pilgrimage. The Colosseum is a part of our modern culture. It is a symbol of ancient Rome, and it is a source of inspiration for countless movies, books, and video games. The image of a gladiator, sword in hand, ready for a fight, is an iconic one, and it is a part of our collective consciousness. The Colosseum, in a way, is a kind of cultural inheritance, a gift from a lost empire that reminds us of the power of entertainment, of spectacle, and of a society that was both brilliant and brutal. A quirky detail you recall is that the Colosseum's design, with its tiered seating and its efficient vomitoria, is still used as a model for modern sports stadiums, a testament to its enduring genius. Now, as you stand there in the quiet of the night, you feel a sense of peace. The Colosseum is silent, but its history is not. Its history is a story of an unfair match, a story of an empire, a story of a people, and a story of a building that has stood for nearly 2 millennia. The sand is cool beneath your feet. The stars are out, and you are finally ready for sleep. The boring history has come to an end, and you can now rest. The gladiators are sleeping, the crowds are gone, and the only sound is the soft hum of the night. Oh, you're safe now. Just close your eyes and let the silence take you. Let the long, quiet, boring story of history lull you into a deep, peaceful slumber. The sun is setting on this long day, and you are free to rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.